Dead Space, like many series, had an ambitious start. It came out swinging, introducing tons of new ideas and interesting concepts. The development team was ready to revolutionize and swing not only the horror genre, but gaming overall in a new direction. But Dead Space didn't always stay that way, and by the end it became something almost unrecognizable. It was a harsh transition that left a lot of people wondering how exactly we got here. That's what I want to look into today. I want to take a deep dive into the Dead Space series. I want to look into every nook and cranny. I'll be exploring every video game, comic, book, and movie. I want to see what made this series so great, but I also want to see what led to its downfall. Over the course of this video, I'll be talking about all three mainline Dead Space games, as well as the two spin-off games, Ignition and Extraction. I'll also be diving into EA's idea of an expanded media universe for Dead Space with 2 animated films, 2 books, 3 comics, and a mobile game. I do want to say before we get into the video though that the movie sections talking specifically about Dead Space Downfall and Dead Space Aftermath will be relegated to the Patreon. This is unfortunately due to YouTube's copyright system, which I just can't get by. Towards the end of the video, we'll take a second to talk to some of the people that have contributed to the discourse around these games. I want to thank everyone that gave me their time to talk about these games and chat for a bit. Boulder Punch, Jingy, and Mandalore Gaming. If you do enjoy the video, you can support the channel for free by liking and subscribing, as it really helps me out. You can also subscribe over on Patreon to support the channel as well, where you can watch some of the full retrospectives that I have that include extra bonus sections like the Dead Space movies or the Silent Hill movies. You can also watch me over on Twitch, where I play games that I'm not currently reviewing. The links to all those are down in the description. Spoiler alert, for everything Dead Space. I mean it. Everything. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I want to talk about Dead Space. Dead Space began with a working title, originally called Rancid Moon. It was the creation of Glenn Schofield, who wanted to create a video game that was truly terrifying. He came up with the idea in 2005 and drew large inspiration from series like Resident Evil and Silent Hill. Before this, Glenn had worked on many games, mostly as art director or artist, but eventually game director. He directed games like Akuji the Heartless, Blood Omen 2, Walt Disney World Quest Magical Racing Tour, and Gex 3, Deep Cover Gecko. Glenn's team at EA Redwood Shores were working on concepts for the game, and it was a pretty big passion project for them. The studio was mostly set to work on games for licensed titles. Eventually, they pitched it to EA, and they had 3 months to create a prototype. The project was greenlit after showing the prototype to EA. They developed the prototype originally on Xbox hardware to fit time constraints, and wanted to figure out how to make it work for next-gen consoles later. Dead Space was developed using the same engine as The Godfather, since the team was already familiar with working in that framework. That engine also used the Havoc physics engine, which was important for the design of Dead Space. The game was described during development as Resident Evil in space. Schofield took huge inspiration from Resident Evil 4 and wanted to create that fear and terror that it had. They wanted to improve on the formula by giving players the ability to walk and shoot at the same time. Schofield felt like RE4 could be really slow, stopping to shoot and breaking up the tension or action. Schofield took a ton of inspiration from films like Alien, The Thing, and Event Horizon. It wasn't just American films, though. Schofield specifically sought the storytelling of Takashi Miike and liked how other cultures treated horror in film. Schofield and the team used all of this information from horror films to make the game more terrifying. Everything from lighting to storytelling in the environment were ideas they got from films. The team wanted to find a really tight balance between the usual slow pace of horror games and the faster pace of third-person action games. It was meant to be a mix between the two, providing the best of both worlds. The team wanted to make the game as immersive as possible. To achieve this, they incorporated the HUD elements into the environment, and cutscenes were played in real time. This was a large change to the average horror formula, but the team didn't stop there. They also incorporated strategic dismemberment, which allowed players to sever enemies' limbs. This was a large challenge for the teams, trying to achieve the maximum amount of points on the body where an enemy could be dismembered without breaking the game. The game also incorporated procedural enemy placements so that players couldn't memorize enemy movements and attack formations. The team reached a large challenge when trying to implement zero-G in the game. They did extensive research on space exploration and survival to make it a realistic interpretation. They also wanted the atmosphere to be the star of the show. In earlier builds of the game, they relied on jump scares. They quickly realized that the effectiveness wore off soon after, and they thinned them out, focusing more on the atmosphere of the environment to instill fear. The sound was incredibly important to Schofield and his team. It was a key element to creating a terrifying atmosphere. They used real-life sounds to create fear and also got a more realized tone for the audio in the game. The team wanted all big moments in the game to be interactive. This was one of the rules that they had for the production of the game, and it couldn't be broken. This led them to a large problem with the development of the game, specifically concerning the drag tentacle. This enemy drags your character and kills you unless you kill it first. This caused huge problems and nothing was working. The sound, animations, and programming were all having issues. The issues arose from the character being in a different position when walking into the hallway. They used layering to solve the issue, dealing with each problem individually to find the source. This was a new management strategy that they had implemented. They ended up having a specific team just for this one tentacle scene. This whole issue stopped development for an entire month, causing a massive slowdown, but the team eventually overcame the problem. Schofield and the team wanted the main character to be an everyman. They wanted him to be just another guy and make you feel like you were him. He doesn't talk in the game, and he's always in frame, making you feel more connected to the character. The entire development of Dead Space was something that was difficult and challenging. The team had not created anything of this size thus far, but a lot was learned, and these challenges were all overcome. The outcome was something handcrafted and of high quality. No shortcuts were taken here. Dead Space was released in North America for the Sony PlayStation 3 and the Microsoft Xbox 360 on October 13th, 2008. As usual, a few notes before we get into things. I played Dead Space on the Xbox Series S using its backwards compatibility feature. This was the easiest and most convenient way to get footage for this game, and it also happens to run pretty smoothly. All three Dead Space games are also on PC, but those versions of the games are a little more finicky than the console version. The second note is on the structure of this review. If you've seen my videos before, you'll know that I try to tailor the structure of each review to the game that I'm playing. For Dead Space, that's no different. Dead Space functions quite a bit like Silent Hill. A lot of the story is told through optional logs and information that's unlocked at the end of the game. Most of the story is right in front of us, but the mystery of the tale and the station that we're playing on is left up to the player to piece together. Because of this, I'll first talk about the story, gameplay, and mechanics of the game, giving my overall impressions. I'll then venture back at the end to talk about what really happened in Dead Space. I also want to give a quick note about the footage that I used for this video. I intermixed footage from both my first and second playthroughs of Dead Space. You might see some footage in the beginning of the game from my second playthrough on New Game Plus, where I have a white suit. I just wanted to point out that I didn't cheat or anything, I just did multiple playthroughs. Dead Space begins with a message from Nicole. This is our main character, Isaac's girlfriend, or was, we're not sure. Isaac is on a mission with two others, Kendra Daniels, a computer specialist, and Zach Hammond, the chief security officer. They are trying to board the USG Ishimura, a large flagship that Nicole is supposedly on. They're on a mission, responding to a distress signal on the Ishimura. They try to dock, but the automatic procedure is disabled, and the ship is badly damaged in the process. All the while, Hammond and Daniels are bickering because Kendra won't follow Hammond's orders. Regardless, the ship lands and the power seems to be out all across the place, and there's no signs of life as of yet. Our main character, Isaac, happens to be the ship's engineer and is sent to check on the ship's vitals. The outlook isn't great, but as he checks outside the room, the place is locked down and strange creatures begin to attack the crew, killing Johnston and Chen, two corporals assisting with the mission. We're forced to run away from the creatures here and head to a nearby elevator. Heading through the ship, we find dead bodies, strange scenes of messages scrawled in blood on the walls, and our first weapon, the plasma cutter. This is our main way of dispensing with enemies in Dead Space. The alien creatures that we fight can be dismembered and take way more damage when doing so. We can also slow them down by taking out their legs or inhibit their ability to attack by taking out their arms. Each weapon in the game has two modes of attack that can be switched out by using the right bumper. In the case of the plasma cutter, this is attacking horizontally or vertically. The plasma cutter is probably one of my favorite weapons in the game and really functions as the bread and butter of our attacks for most of this entry. It's old reliable, and coming back to it is always something you can depend on. Like I said before, the team did away with the HUD in Dead Space. Because of this, Isaac's health is represented on his suit in the world rather than a menu sitting at the bottom of the screen. This allows for much more immersion in the world and really makes you feel like you're in the character's shoes rather than playing a video game. This does exactly what I was talking about earlier, break down the wall of immersion to instill fear in the player. We take out our first necromorph and head to the tram station. Here we're contacted by Hammond, who isn't dead at all. They're just as clueless as us about the origins of these monsters and the situation with the Ishimura. The goal is to get to the bridge, but before they can do that, we need to repair the tram system that runs through the ship. It's the only way they'll be able to get around and make it to the different areas of the vessel. Kendra isn't as keen on the idea of trying to fix the ship, she just wants to get out. Hammond tells Isaac that if he fixes the tram, he'll help find Nicole on the ship. We realize that Isaac has a personal stake in what happens on this mission. He didn't just come here for his job, he came here to see if she was all right. We have to venture into the ship to try and replace the tram car with a different one. On the way, we're introduced to Stasis, one of two suit powers that we'll be able to use in the game. This gives us a small meter on our suit that allows us to slow down an object's speed and time. We use this to solve many different puzzles in the game, but we can also use it on particularly fast enemies to deal with them easier. We have to get two arms to grab the damaged tram and pull it out, but one of the arms only stays in place for a second. We have to use stasis and eject the tram in time. All the while, we're being attacked by necromorphs coming out of the vents. This is how they travel around the ship, attacking from all sides. The sound of Dead Space is one of the biggest things that makes the game truly terrifying. We know exactly when an enemy has entered the room because of the sound. The score notifies us, a large, jumpy, scraping sound, a rising in intensity of the music, and the gurgles of nearby beasts trying to take our life. After playing for long enough, this becomes subconscious. You hear the noise of a coming threat, and you begin searching, scanning the room for where it could have come from. Dead Space doesn't hold back, though. It has no qualms throwing enemies behind you when you're dealing with another. Once the fighting has begun, there's no way to tell how many are coming your way. It's terrifying, and you always feel truly alone, out in the open, vulnerable. Now that we've got the tram replaced, we have to call it. But first, we have to get to the computer online, because of course, it's broken. We head to the storage room first. We enter a large room here with multiple walkways going either way. This is always a troubling situation, because without scanning the room, there's no way to know whether there's another enemy waiting at the other end. It's terrifying, and Dead Space never makes you truly feel safe. There are moments of relief, sure, but we never truly feel like we can relax. Isaac grabs a new data board for the computer, and we're introduced to the bench, Dead Space's main upgrade system. We can collect power nodes throughout the game, mostly in containers placed on walls. They can also be dropped from enemies or bought from the store, though. We can use these nodes to unlock different paths for our weapons, suit, or kinesis and stasis modules. We can upgrade our health through the suit or the damage output of weapons and even their reload speed. We have to backtrack now, heading to the computer that we started at. We replace its board and call the tram for Hammond and Daniels. They head to the bridge to find out what happened to the ship. The lockdown has also been lifted, so some of the doors have been unlocked. Kendra again questions Hammond's ability to get them out of this situation, but he is dedicated to the mission and puts her in her place. Isaac heads back to the Kellyan to try and start the engines and get ready for their departure. We're attacked by multiple beasts on our way there, and when Isaac tries to start the ship, it explodes in a fiery blaze. The damage it endured during docking was clearly too much. We're assaulted by multiple monsters on the dock, even a new type, the Leaper. These are almost long, lizard-like creatures, a disgusting warping of the human body. They jump at you and attack with their tails. Kendra is distraught about the destruction of the Kellyan, their only way out now gone. Hammond decides to try and fix the ship, but they need Captain's authorization first. The Captain is already dead, so we need to get his codes to continue. Hammond sends the tram back to us so we can head back to the medical deck, where the Captain's body is at. We see the two attacked by a Leaper before we're cut off from them. We head to the tram and get our first store in the game. Here we can buy items like ammo for our weapons, new suits or weapons themselves, health packs, stasis packs, or anything else we'll need on our adventure. We can also sell equipment or items that we find here to get more credits. We take the tram to the medical bay and find a blindfolded woman on the ground, laying beside a mangled body. She gives us something before dying on the floor. Here, we receive the second of our two suit powers, the kinesis module. This lets us grab and move large objects from a distance. This is also a puzzle-solving power. We'll have to use it for many different puzzles and traversal throughout the game, but it can also be used to grab and throw things at enemies. It's especially useful when grabbing an exploding canister and blowing up multiple monsters at once. Hammond contacts us again. He got separated from Kendra. We need to get past a barricade in the medical wing. The only way to do so is to blow it up. We have to get thermite and a shock pad. Inside the medical offices, we find a strange video recording of two people from the ship talking about something called the Marker. Heading through the rooms, we find a crew member alive, but he's quickly killed by a new monster type, the Lurker. These are small enemies that can crawl on walls and ceilings. They sprout 3 tentacles that shoot projectiles at us and can be incredibly annoying. The best way to deal with them, though, is to dismember each tentacle, usually killing them. We find the thermite upstairs and head towards the shock pad. I just want to comment quickly on Dead Space's environment. Its lighting is incredibly well done and does a lot to add to the atmosphere of the game. Lights flickering in certain rooms, orange flashing to initiate a quarantine, total darkness in some areas. It's atmospheric and terrifying. We're always sort of in the dark, but this dim light or these flickering ones make us feel unease. When we're in areas that are actually well lit, we almost feel a brief reprieve. The audience relaxes because maybe, just for a moment, we might be safe. When the enemies swarm the medical offices, the room darkens because of a lockdown. This is a hectic moment. We have to fight off lots of monsters coming from all directions. Our senses are assaulted and the anxiety is on high. When we clear the room, the lockdown is lifted and we're allowed to breathe for a moment. The music subsides and the light brightens again. We're never told that we're safe. We just assume it. We can feel it. The game conveys tone through its environment to provide an incredible effect on the player, manipulating their emotions. We find a crew member smashing his head against the wall until he's dead. We also find a doctor's examination of a patient on the colony from the planet beneath. We can collect and pick up a lot of items in Dead Space. It's really what we rely on. We can't buy every piece of ammo or health in the game. We'd simply run out of credits and supplies. We can pick up items from lockers, ammo, health, schematics to unlock new things in the shop. Enemies drop items. We'll find them everywhere, encouraging us to explore every room, every nook and cranny. We can use power nodes to unlock special rooms in the game that usually have huge caches of ammo and equipment, but also will sometimes have optional audio logs or memos that fill in our gaps of what happened on the Ishimura. Here, we have to use our new kinesis power to move a platform into place and place a battery into a slot, powering an elevator, as well as defeat multiple different necromorphs. Here, we enter our first vacuum, probably one of the most terrifying experiences in this game. The sound goes completely dead. We can only hear the faint thumps of Isaac's steps or the subdued pangs of a shot from the plasma cutter. Encountering enemies in these spaces are even worse situations. Remember how we talked about how our biggest indicator to an enemy's presence is sound, atmosphere, the feeling? Well, that's gone in a vacuum, only being able to rely on our sight. When in a vacuum, we have a certain amount of air, which slowly decreases. We have minimal time before we need to refill our O2 at a station, or get out of the vacuum. I love these experiences so much. Not only is our anxiety high because we're trying to get out, but we're also trying to figure out if any monsters are nearby and defeat them as quick as possible. We also immediately get our first taste of zero-G here. Certain rooms won't have gravity enabled on the ship. We can aim at a spot and jump to it. This is great for traversing across a room to get to an objective or even solving puzzles later on. The zero-G can get a little wonky in certain circumstances, like when running through a curved pipe, the camera likes to go nuts. In this room, we find the shock pad and are attacked by necromorphs on our way out. Isaac backtracks to the barricade and blows it up, allowing him access to the medical bay. Suddenly, we receive a transmission from Nicole, a ship-wide communication asking for help. It seems like this is from before, not something current. In the morgue, we're assaulted by more enemies and find a woman sawing a human patient open, eventually taking the saw to her own neck. When we arrive at the morgue, we see a strange creature, a new enemy called the Infector, feed on a dead body. The Infectors transform dead humans into powered-up necromorphs. Getting these guys and killing them before they can transform others is paramount when we encounter them. The worst thing we can face is a room full of powered-up necromorphs. We find the captain's body and his access codes with it. Hammond starts to access the captain's records while we head back to the tram station. In the morgue is a strange language scrawled on the walls in blood. Hammond contacts us and says that he got attacked, but trapped one of the monsters in an escape pod. When Hammond looks at the ship's records, he says that the mutations on the ship aren't an infection, but a form of alien life. It arose when the ship cracked the planet below open. Worse news is that the ship's engines are offline, and the ship is falling in orbit. We need to head to the engineering deck next. We take the tram there. Each level functions in a pretty similar way. We usually take the tram to a new wing and are introduced to a small base area, which usually has a bench, a store, and a save point. This is kind of our breather area, the place we can recover and upgrade our weapons, strengthening ourselves. It's a point of relaxation, but that's not entirely true. Even these hub areas are not off limits to Dead Space. We'll see enemies in the hub areas from time to time, and the first time this happened to me, it was the most jarring thing. I realized in an instant that I wasn't safe anywhere. The biggest thing that Dead Space does is make you feel vulnerable. You quickly realize that everywhere is a danger zone. There is a run button in the game, but for the first half you almost don't even want to use it because you don't know what's around each corner. It's terrifying to turn past it and see nothing or something. The anticipation is what kills in this game. You're out in the open and you know that you'll be attacked. You just don't know when or from where. The game will hide monsters in piles of bodies so that you can't see them. They'll come from the vents behind you, above you. Anywhere they can attack, they will. It's this constant assault from the minute that we start playing the game that instills a certain anxiety in you from the start. There were so many times that I opened up the store, heard enemies on the other side of the door beside me, and closed it to check my surroundings before trying to buy something. When a game can make you terrified to buy ammo, you know it's done its job as a horror. We have two jobs in this area, to refuel the engines and get the gravity centrifuge working. In our new hub, we find a man dead in his chair. Tons of audio and text logs document the downfall of the ship. Crew members turning on each other, people trying to survive in this place. We have to take a gondola across a large chasm to refuel the engines. When we head back to the hub, an infector has gotten in and turned that dead guy into a necromorph, once again soiling our supposed safe area. We head to the centrifuge. On the way, we find a decontamination chamber. Here, the room is locked down and we're assaulted by a variety of enemies. This was one of the heights of fear for me, a shining moment in the horror that is Dead Space. The lights are shut off. It's almost complete darkness. The room isn't even square. We can't be sure where the threats are going to come from. We have to be prepared from all angles. Eventually, they drop from the ceiling. If we're dealing with one monster, we might be assaulted by another. It's a terrifying moment in the game. There's two types of horror in Dead Space: fear and anxiety. The fear is the classical description of horror, something creeping, crawling, the blood on the walls, gurgling sounds off in the distance. It's the atmosphere, the anticipation of the fight, the psychological. The other type of horror is anxiety. This is the fight or flight feeling, not when we're anticipating the fight, but when we're actually in it. The moment when we're swarmed by enemies. We've worried about the situation to come, but now we have to deal with it. This is a much more visceral fear, one that we experience in our bones. In the decontamination chamber, our anxiety is on full display. Once we defeat the enemies, we can make our way to the centrifuge. Here we have to use stasis on two large objects, moving them into the center of the room to start the machine. Once we boot it up, space opens underneath us and we have to avoid the spinning blade in the center, defeating enemies in a vacuum once more. When we get out, we're attacked by the drag tentacle, the one we talked about so much in the development section, a shock to the system. Kendra contacts us once again. She's alive. She's barricaded in the computer core. She found corroborating evidence that the colonists below were experiencing dementia from something called the Marker, an artifact found on the planet. She sends us next to fuel storage to access the engine chamber. On our way back, we head through a section of the ship, machines pumping incredibly loud in our ears. This juxtaposition is presented quite a bit throughout Dead Space, the comparison between the pumping sounds of the ship's equipment and the sounds of the monsters that inhabit it. Possibly faking us out, possibly commenting on the fact that this biological species functions exactly like a machine. When we reach the engine room, Isaac restarts the equipment. Hammond contacts to say that the engines are working and the ship is rising in orbit. Kendra has bad news, though. The asteroid defense systems are offline. We need to get them back or the rocks will destroy us. Kendra confronts Hammond about the Marker, thinking that he knew about it all along and didn't tell them. She basically accuses him of lying. Apparently, the Marker is in the cargo hold on the ship. We have to get to the captain's nest to get the asteroid systems online. We finally reunite with Hammond, and he says he truly doesn't know about the Marker. He also says we need to reroute power to the ADS system. On the way out, we see an escape pod that houses the necromorph Hammond trapped. He jettisons it into space. Upstairs, we're confronted by our first brute. These are massive, hulking beasts that are incredibly strong. We have to stun them with attacks from the front and attack their back when they go to cover. The best way to take care of them is to use stasis to freeze them once they go for cover and rip into their back. We head through, rerouting power in multiple different junction boxes to the ADS. We eventually encounter our first pregnant necromorph. These have tons of swarmers in their stomach. If we shoot the stomach, swarmers descend on us and they can be a real problem. The only way to take it out is to tear its legs and arms away. After we get the last junction box, Hammond says the ADS targeting is down. We need to manually aim it, so we have to head to the cannon pit. To get there, we have to cross outside the ship, though. We have to jump through 0G from cover to cover, making sure that the asteroids don't shred us to pieces, or that we don't run out of air. There's another fear that Dead Space plays on. Not just the fear of monsters, the dark or flickering lights, but that of space. We're constantly thrown into the vast vacuum, the void that is outer space. One of the most terrifying things is hearing Isaac's chokes and gasps as his body begs for air. It's visceral and terrifying, watching your character die wanting for oxygen. It's a strange sort of fear, one more of death than anything else, but it's one that the game forces on us nonetheless. Here we have a really odd game segment. There's 2 of these in Dead Space. We have to man a turret and shoot asteroids as they run into the hull of the ship. I'll be honest, I think this was one of the very few weak points for Dead Space. This is where it started to veer into an action game a little bit. They are very short moments, so I don't fault the overall product that much for this one section, but I do think they're a bit out of place. We defend the ship from asteroids, and Hammond gets the autopilot working, allowing the ship to do its own work. Kendra calls and says that the oxygen is being poisoned by something in the hydroponics department. We have to get rid of it because there won't be any air to breathe soon. Kendra is going to come up with a poison to destroy it, but we have to get there first. Once we get to medical, Kendra says the contaminated air is spreading. We have to find the chemicals to mix the poison. Inside the main room, we hear a man speaking to us through the sound system. Kendra says someone has reprogrammed the door locks. Someone else is here. I've talked pretty great about Dead Space so far, so I think I'll take this moment to point out a bit of a negative. The game reuses quite a bit of environments. We'll see the same room or area reused multiple times, just with more or less blood, objects, and moving pieces. I don't think it would be that bad, but some of the areas are very distinct, so they're pretty easily recognizable. I can mostly forgive this though because the game was so detailed for its time, and every area being completely unique probably wasn't too realistic. We eventually find a lab that has the chemical we need to make the poison, but now we need to find a DNA sample to mix it with. Unfortunately, someone has showed up. He tells us fighting against all this is pointless. He's some type of scientist and wants to show us his greatest creation, humanity's child, the thing that will replace us. Just then, the hunter crashes out of its nearby tube. This is an enemy that can't be killed. Even if we sever all of its limbs, it'll only be briefly downed while it regenerates those limbs pretty quickly. This introduces a whole host of new anxiety to the game and atmosphere of Dead Space. It doesn't matter where we go or what we do from here on out. We know that this thing could jump out of any corner and ruin our time. But why is it so terrifying? Because we know when it's around, our reprieve from the terror is a long way away. Even when we fight waves and waves of enemies, at least we know once we kill them, it'll be over soon, and we can breathe. With the hunter, we know it's never over. We have to run from it and make our way through the corridors. Hammond calls us to say that the infected air is getting to him. We had to look for a DNA sample, but we encountered the scientist again. He says that everyone should die for their cause. There's nothing we can do against this insurmountable wall. As we head through the next room, the hunter appears again. We have to defeat multiple enemies while also fending it off. We can shoot off its limbs and slow it down with stasis, but that's only temporary. We make it to the next room and find a guardian. These are beasts that are growing from the walls. They spit out smaller creatures that can shoot projectiles. They're pretty dangerous because if we get too close, we're automatically decapitated. And also, their screams are terrifying. We eventually find a DNA sample in the scientist's office. He has severed heads that he's captured, and scrawlings cover his walls. He interrupts our communication with Kendra to tell us that we should accept our fate. He decompresses the deck, causing us to enter a vacuum everywhere. We have to get to the security station to get the air back. We get the life support back online, but now we have to mix the sample. Kendra says that some massive beast has entered the colony from outside. That's when the air quality went down. Someone on the ship called it the Leviathan. We mix the sample, and now we have to head to hydroponics to use it. We find the scientist again, blocking our way to the tram. He says his name is Dr. Chalice Mercer. He wants to show us his plan in full and leaves us with his creation. The hunter is back again, but this time we can get rid of it, at least for a while. We have to defeat it by locking it in the freezing chamber, using stasis and activating the room. Once this is done, we don't have to deal with it for a while. We head into the tram and head for hydroponics. When we arrive, we find Hammond injured in the area. He's been breathing the contaminated air and won't survive for long. He says the crew on the deck are transformed and are contributing to poison in the air. These are wheezers. In each area, we have to find multiple wheezers and take them out. This will clear the air and make it breathable. Most of this takes place in an incredibly open plant room. Like I said before, these open rooms are our worst enemy. Corridors in Dead Space can be dealt with. Trust me, they're terrifying. But there's really only two places enemies can come from, in front of us or behind us. In a large open room, they can come from anywhere. It's incredibly easy to get overwhelmed and feel exposed, vulnerable. Dead Space does a great job at accomplishing this goal, making you feel like you're alone and about to be attacked from all angles. It's almost like the game purposefully manipulates every possible fear that you could have. It sinks its teeth into the core of your feelings and uses them against you. Through this area, we'll also encounter exploders. These are small, lanky creatures that lumber towards us. They have a pod on their arms, and if shot, it will explode. This explosion is pretty large and damaging. It can be used to give us the upper hand in a firefight, but it can also destroy us. We have to run through multiple areas, traverse through 0G, and take out tons of enemies to eventually destroy the last of the Weezers. This allows us to recycle the air and clean most of the contamination, but it will never be gone until we destroy the Leviathan. This is our first real boss fight in Dead Space, and it comes about halfway through the game. The Leviathan has 3 tentacles at the beginning of the fight. When they expose their pods, we have to destroy them and get rid of each. After that, the center of the Leviathan will begin shooting its own exploding pods at us. We have to use kinesis to shoot them back into its mouth. After we do this a few times, the tentacles will return to try and stop us, but damaging the center enough will kill the thing. The boss is terrifyingly large. It's eldritch in size and shape. It looks like something that's too large for us to comprehend. It's designed very well, but it's also a great fight. It keeps in theme with the immersion that the team was trying to create. No boss health bars, no UI, just us having to intuit what to do to defeat the thing. With it destroyed, the oxygen levels are back to normal, but Hammond is not responding. Kendra wants us to head to the SOS beacon to try and send a distress call to other ships. We take the tram towards it. Our goal is to attach the SOS beacon to an asteroid that's being smelted. We can launch the asteroid out into space and hopefully someone will be able to find it. So, I know I said that there are no safe spaces truly in Dead Space, but I lied. Up until this point in the game, elevators have been pretty much the safest place we could be. When we're traveling in them, we're not attacked generally. Even in the first few minutes of the game, it's established that elevators are a safe area. When a necromorph tries to attack us on the elevator and is beheaded. But in this area, even this is taken away from us. As we take the elevator down to the lower levels, we're assaulted by multiple enemies dropping into the top of the open mining elevator. It's a rough experience because it's another reminder by the game developers that you are not safe. On the next floor, we have to clear boulders from a room to be able to get through. We have to use our kinesis to shoot them into a gravity beam. We get a mining access key to let us into the other areas of this level. We use a gondola to cross a large space and are assaulted from all sides by enemies shooting projectiles at us. Once we reach the other side, we finally see Nicole.
Isaac? Is that really you? It feels like it's been so long. But I can help you now. Come with me.
The beacon is nearby, but Nicole has to disable the lock. We have to protect her from the other side, killing all of the enemies that try to attack her and us. She says she'll find a way to Isaac and tells him she loves him before heading off. We find the SOS beacon and head to the mining bay. In the subdeck, we have to release all 4 gravity tethers that are holding the asteroid in place. We have to use stasis to slow them down and then shoot one of their capacitors. 2 of the tethers are inside the ship, but the other 2 are outside. We have to 0G jump onto the asteroid and walk around it, avoiding the incredibly dangerous rings circulating the thing. I love these huge, massive rooms and set pieces. They always just look so grandiose. Not only does it make you feel like you're seeing something so incredibly massive and beautiful, but it also makes you wonder exactly how many people were working on this ship. The vast crews of people that made this thing run, that had lives on this vessel, all gone, void of any life. It feels hollow now. Once we destroy the tethers, we can place the beacon and launch the asteroid. Kendra says that she's started to see her brother again, even though she knows he isn't alive. Our next goal is to fix the communications array so that people can respond to the distress beacon. We head back to the tram once again. Kendra says that a military ship, the USM Valor, just shocked in next to them. We can't communicate with them until we get the comms array working, though. Kendra says that she thinks someone is listening in on their communications. We finally reach the array, but a lot of the dishes have been damaged. We have to use kinesis to arrange them in a ring so that they can start working again. Once we do this, we receive a comm from one of the people aboard the USM Valor. He says they picked up our escape pod, the one that Hammond jettisoned. Great. It's an automated response that repeats every 30 seconds. Kendra needs to communicate with the ship to try and get in contact with them and warn them about the necromorph. She needs to get the blast doors open to boost the signal, though, and there's something blocking the way. We have another strange cannon segment where we have to shoot down different tentacles from a large beast that's blocking the blast doors. Again, I think this is just a little action-y for the tone that the game was setting previously, and is an odd addition to the game that it probably would have survived without. It definitely isn't game-breaking, it just disrupts the flow a little bit. Once it's defeated, Kendra tries to contact the Valor to tell them not to open the escape pod, but they won't respond. We see their video feed of one of their men being attacked, and the ship is floating straight towards us. Isaac is knocked out from the blast and wakes up to the same message from Nicole as before. It quickly switches to Hammond. He's still alive and says that his signal has been blocked this whole time. He finally decides to abort the mission. They all have to get out. He found a shuttle on the crew deck. It needs a new core, though, that we can salvage from the USM Valor. I should probably talk about the weapons of Dead Space. We've already talked about the plasma cutter, but there are many more weapons we can collect in the game, being able to equip 4 at the same time. The 4 I used mostly stayed with me throughout the game. The plasma cutter was obviously my mainstay. It's accurate and reliable. It can be used to easily sever appendages, and when it's upgraded all the way, it can do some real damage, even being such a small weapon. The second one I used the most was the line gun. This was a pretty close second favorite to the plasma cutter. It basically functions like the plasma cutter, shooting a horizontal bolt at the enemies, but it's much wider. It can devastate enemies, even though it holds much less ammo, and finding it is more difficult. The pulse rifle was my third favorite. It's mostly a generic fast-shooting rifle with a lot of ammunition and a big clip. It can be used to success even on bigger enemies, but is a little harder to target limbs without wasting a bunch of ammo. My least favorite weapon I used was the Ripper. I don't really know why I kept this one on me the entire game, but I did. I think it was mostly because I had so much ammo for it, and I just kept finding the most ammo for that gun throughout the game. It was an insane amount, so I couldn't just put it away. Through most of the game, it was a terrible gun. It shoots out blades that hover in front of you for a brief period. You can guide the blade and use it to slice enemies apart. Its secondary shot just fires a projectile blade out from the weapon, though. I really made it a point to upgrade this weapon in the later game, when ammo was becoming an issue. You'll be forced at certain points in the game to exhaust your entire arsenal, as you only have so much ammo for each weapon. These moments can get really intense because you're swapping through all your weapons only to realize you have to use the Ripper to defeat this wave of enemies. The weapon wasn't a bad idea, it just doesn't do that much damage from the get-go, so upgrading it is a must if you're going to use it. Once you do, it can actually function pretty well, but it requires a lot of nodes, and you might be better off just using those for your suit or plasma cutter. I do enjoy the arsenal and variety in weapons that you're presented with in Dead Space. It does feel like certain weapons were designed for certain enemies, so you always have a tool to deal with the situation that you're presented with. We head to the tram and make our way towards the Valor. Hammond thinks that the Valor was sent to destroy the ship, not save them. He's cut off before he can finish, and Kendra says they lost his signal. The Valor is sticking into the side of the ship, but it's locked, and we have to dispense with the radioactive orbs that fell out of its weapons during the crash. Inside the Valor, the military men that have been infected were already wearing stasis units in their body armor when they died. This has been merged into their body when they were infected, creating hyper-fast necromorphs. These guys are very threatening, but the best way to take them down is to use stasis to slow them and rip them apart quickly. The whole ship is a mess. It's burning and sheared in half. We have to make our way through the broken and shattered vessel. We eventually receive a transmission from a man named Dr. Terrence Kine. He wants us to help him by repairing the shuttle. He says that humanity will be wiped out unless we return the marker to it. We can't just run. Inside the military base, we encounter an odd little shooting range that will reward us for completing stages. This is the real safe area. We eventually get to the room that the core is in, but the engines are firing inside of it. We have to use turbines to make our way down the hall and shut them off. Once we get the core, Kendra tells us to head to the crew deck. We finally see Hammond again, but he's being chased by a brute. He's on the other side of the glass, though, and he's killed. We defeat the brute ourselves and head out. As we leave, the ship begins to explode. Kendra found the shuttle that Hammond was talking about, but the navigation cards have been removed. We have to get 3 of them on the crew deck, and we'll be able to use the shuttle to leave. Entering the main area of this deck, we see tons of bodies with white wraps around their faces, shot in the head. We find Dr. Chalice as he kills a man, a believer, he calls them. We encounter a new enemy while looking for the nav cards, dividers. These are very tall, lanky creatures that, when we kill them, spawn multiple smaller enemies. They're tough, but can be taken out easily at range. We get contacted by Dr. Kine again, and he wants to talk to us after we have the nav cards. Dead Space has something truly great. It's sort of an undefinable quality. Most would call it atmosphere, but I think it's different than that. I call it a feeling. This feeling delivers terror and fear, surely. It creates an environment that is hostile, aggressive, depressing, and oppressive. It's terrifying to be in this world for any period of time, but why is that? It's because of this feeling that you get while playing it. This feeling can be described by all of the parts that make it, the ones that we've already talked about at depth. The lighting that dredges up childhood fears of the dark, the sound that makes you remember your terror of things that go bump in the night, the horrifying creatures lumbering at you around every corner. This dire situation that you spend the entire game trying to get out of. But this feeling isn't just these parts. It's all of these things combined and placed perfectly that creates something completely different. The feeling. One that permeates every second of gameplay. It's relentless. It's horrific. It's graphic. It's the heights that horror games aspire to. The delicate balance that we talked about at the beginning of the video is here. The scales of justice have been evened. The teeter-totter is at a flawless center. The pencil is resting perfectly in the center of your finger. It works just right. Isaac eventually finds another nav card and an extremely fun minigame in the process. Apparently the crew of the Ishimura like to play Z-ball. This is basically basketball in 0G. We can jump around to platforms to increase our multiplier and shoot the ball into one of the 4 baskets to get more points. It gives us some rewards for completing each round. In the next room, we see a spinning video of Chalice speaking to some believers who have turned their back on the faith. We find a section of kinesis movable bunk beds that we have to navigate through. We find the final nav card and Chalice contacts us to say his creation is back, reborn. The hunter has returned and we have to run. Escaping back into the bunk section is incredibly terrifying with this thing at our back, and we have no idea if it'll be able to get through or not. We have to stay alive in the next room while Kendra gets the door unlocked. Kine congratulates us on getting the nav cards and tells us to meet him. Kendra says that the man might be unstable and violent, to be careful around him. Kine tells us that escape is impossible, that the shock point drive on the shuttle is downed. Kine is clearly raving, but he shows us a video of a massive beast called the Hive Mind that came from the core of the planet. It controls the necromorphs telepathically. He claims that the marker contains the Hive Mind, and if we return to the planet, it can be trapped again. Our only choice now is to get the marker back to the planet and end this thing. We start the engines of the shuttle and the hunter returns, but we're going to take it out for good. We have to trap it behind the shuttle's exhaust and burn it. We can do this by cutting its legs off and hitting it with stasis, running back and starting the engines. Kyne arrives and takes the shuttle over to the flight deck so that we can grab the marker and load it up. Chalice contacts us and once again tells us to accept our fate as he lets an infector attack him. We see this happening in the next room and have to defeat this newly changed Chalice, which is all the same as the rest. Kyne tells us to head to the cargo bay so that we can get the marker to the hangar. The cargo bay is terrifyingly open. There are so many points of entry for enemies, and at this point in the game, they're all pretty fast. We never know which direction we're going to get attacked from, paranoid looking every way to locate the nearest threat. Tentacles will even attack us from underneath the platforms. Our goal here is to move the marker from one end to the other and then send it up to the hangar. We head up to the flight deck, back to where we started the game at. We turn off gravity and have to move the marker to the ship, all the while defending ourselves from multiple assaults by different monsters. Once we get it in position, we restore gravity to the room so Kyne can load it. He invites us onto the ship so we can stop this once and for all, but he's killed just before we step on. The shuttle takes off, someone else inside. We realize it's Kendra. She was an agent with the Earth government. The planet was an experiment and the marker was made by humans. They reverse engineered it from a different artifact and activated it on the planet. The system has been sealed, but since the CEC got involved, they had to stop it. The game really throws us off her tail the entire time because she's constantly mistrusting Hammond, who we actually think is the traitor. Nicole calls us at this point. She's in the control room, ready to help. We find her upstairs and she apologizes for what she did to Isaac before. She tells us to pull the shuttle back, piloting it from here, and says something strange.
Make us whole again. Make us whole again.
All of the monitors have that strange language flashing on them. We pull the shuttle back, but Kendra flees to the planet below in the escape pod. We head downstairs to get on the shuttle, our second to last chapter ending with us getting on a ship, not a tram. Down there, Nicole joins us and tells Isaac she's happy they're back together. We finally head down to the planet and put the marker onto a loader so we can take it to the planet crack and seal the hive mind controlling everything. Throughout this whole level, we have to move the marker along a track with kinesis. We have to get bridges and doors out of its way and take it to the center of the colony. We're attacked by huge swarms of enemies, every single variation that we've seen so far. Just massive waves of them come plummeting at us. We eventually find the hive mind sticking out of the ground and take the marker up to it. We see Nicole. She says thank you and that we're whole again. The marker activates and we have to get out of the area because it's about to explode. As we enter the decontamination chamber, Kendra arrives, taking the marker with her. She calls Isaac insane and tells us to look again at the video that Nicole sent. This time, we watch to the end and see that she injected herself with some sort of poison. She's dead. Kendra says we were experiencing hallucinations. Isaac was just a pawn this whole time, manipulated by the marker. We head back to the shuttle, but as Kendra tries to board, she's killed by the hive mind, and we have to fight it. It has pods on its mouth that we have to destroy to damage it. During the whole fight, we have to avoid its massive tentacles that try to slam us to the ground. After we destroy its mouth pods, we have to tackle the ones in its chest. The tentacles get more aggressive here. Once we destroy all the pods, the hive mind collapses and slinks back into the planet. I really like this final boss, and I don't mind it being a huge action set piece. I think the final boss should be. It should really ramp up the stakes for the end of the game and take it to the max. That's exactly what the hive mind does. After it's defeated, Isaac flies the shuttle out of orbit. He's seen piloting the ship and he finally takes his mask off. He briefly watches the video of Nicole before stopping it. Just before the end, Isaac sees Nicole again, jumping from the side of the ship. Dead Space is truly one of a kind. It was a game that purposefully tried to innovate, and the team would accept nothing less. It's a landmark and a touchstone in the history of horror games. It changed what horror games would be for years to come. You can see the influence all over the space horror games today. I think it really raised the bar for horror games moving forward, and was one of the last true horror games of its era. It created a feeling and a sense that stuck with you the entire time. The feeling that Something wasn't right. It's almost like you become in tune with the game at a certain point. The game is speaking another language and you realize exactly what it's telling you. You know when to run. You know when to fight. It's working on another level to manipulate your senses. Isaac may have been a pawn for the marker, but we feel like a pawn to Glenn Schofield. It feels like he's pulling every string, eliciting every reaction inside. The terror, the fear, the anxiety, it's all perfectly placed. We're given incredibly brief moments of reprieve that we know subconsciously won't last long and aren't real, but they still feel substantial when we want anything, just even one more breath. It's a fantastic horror experience and one that needs to be played. We've talked about the game in its entirety, but I'm sure that you could tell there's a lot more to the story of Dead Space. So what really happened on the colony and to the USG Ishimura? The captain of the ship was secretly an agent of the Church of Unitology. This is a religion that is based on the belief that humans were created by some sort of divine alien race or being. They also believe that they'll all be unified after death through the doing of the marker. Matthias was assigned to retrieve the red marker for the church from the planet Aegis 7. This planet was quarantined ages ago by the Earth government. The CEC, or the Concordance Extraction Corporation, is a company that specializes in deep space mining. They created the Planet Cracker starships that Ishimura happens to be. These ships establish a colony on the planet to be mined and place gravity tethers around the surface in a ring-like shape. The starship then uses these tethers to pull a large chunk of the planet out, then mining it for resources. The CEC determined that Aegis 7 was rich with valuable resources, so they established a colony there. The employees on the planet discovered the red marker, but unfortunately, some unitologists were among them. The church was made aware, and many unitologists, including the captain, quickly took over the ranks of the project and Ishimura's crew. The unitologists took this opportunity to capture the red marker, possibly seeking the reason and method of their own creation. After the marker was discovered on the planet, though, the colonists began having severe and violent hallucinations. The same cases were reported on the ship once the marker was extracted. In some cases, people became homicidal and suicidal, probably leading to what happened with Nicole. During the same time the marker was uncovered, a growth began taking over the colony and the Ishimura, filling its ventilation systems. The planet crack went forward despite all this. As soon as the crack happened, the colony's power went out and they were flooded with attacks from a strange alien life form. These were the necromorphs, infecting the colonists and transforming them. Captain Matthias immediately cut off all traffic and communication with the colony. He didn't want the infection spreading to the ship. Dr. Kine tried to convince the captain to send out a distress signal and stop the extraction, but he refused, wanting to get the marker to the church. Kine tried to relieve the captain of his duties as he thought the captain was suffering a psychological break and clearly wasn't paying attention to the safety of the crew. He tried to sedate the man, but ended up killing him in the process. This could have been accidental, or just another symptom of the marker that was present on the ship. The infection spread to the ship by way of a shuttle that had escaped from the colony. A survivor had made its way to the Ishimura, not knowing that a necromorph had made its way onto the ship. The ship was sabotaged, all of the escape pods launched, but empty. A crew member eventually used their last moments to send out a distress signal. This was picked up by the CEC, who launched the Kellion to investigate. The Earth government eventually found out about the Ishimura being in a restricted system and dispatched agents to find out what was happening. This was Kendra Daniels' mission, to retrieve the marker for the Earth government. She was assisted by the USM Valor, the ship that tried to destroy the Ishimura. We find out at the end of the game that the red marker is a human creation. It was made using the original marker that had been found on Earth. The carvings in the side of the marker were the DNA instructions for the necromorph infection. The infection escaped and killed everyone on the original colony. The marker was abandoned on the planet, which is why the system was locked down by the Earth government in the first place. The story is mostly hidden through background notes and audio logs that can be found on the ship. A lot of these are optional and won't be found when just making a beeline through the place. It's certainly not as hidden as something like Silent Hill's story is, but it still requires some piecing together. Most of the information is given to us in a non-linear way, so we have to figure out the timeline, putting things in the correct places. It's a really interesting story behind it all, though, and isn't necessary to understand what happens in the game. It's just interesting lore that serves to flesh the world out further. Overall, Dead Space succeeds at what it originally set out to do. It tried to create a truly terrifying horror experience that would stand the test of time. Dead Space has aged incredibly well. It still feels like a modern game, and there's not a lot that I would even consider dated. Most of the innovative choices in design are what caused this. The lighting used to further push the atmosphere of the game prevents its textures from looking old. The in-world cutscenes, all being played on static transmissions from Isaac's suit, prevent too much detail from being noticed in the character models. The game's UI being placed in-world on your character's suit prevents design elements that were hot at the time being used, causing the game to appear less dated. All of these innovations serve their own purposes to further the game's standing in the horror genre. They make the player more immersed in the world to generate an atmosphere that terrifies but also intrigues. But they also serve the purpose of making the game still look great 14 years later. The gameplay of Dead Space is amazing, and it's tied into everything. The horror and the way the game functions go hand in hand. It's terrifying to play. Every corner we pass, every door we open, every dead body we see, we suspect of being a necromorph. We're truly alone on this ship, and we learn very early on that we cannot trust the game. We can't trust anyone. It's ruthless, and once we realize that, we know not to believe anything it throws at us. But Dead Space, even with that distrust, manages to throw scares and terrors at us that we aren't expecting. It teaches us to survive on this derelict, infected ship. It puts us through a trial by fire. The scares aren't lessened by the end of the game, and running away from enemies in Chapter 12 is still just as terrifying as in Chapter 1. But the game slowly makes us realize over the course of its playtime that it isn't holding anything back. It will be trying, purposefully, to terrify us at every point. The balance that we talked about before is on perfect display here. Dead Space creates the perfect illusion and makes you truly believe that you're in the shoes of Isaac Clarke on board the USG Ishimura. With that illusion intact, the game can then begin to throw terrifying situations at us that are all the more amplified because we believe in them. I do really enjoy Dead Space. There were a very few small nitpicks that I had, like the turret shooting sequences or the reused rooms, but they weren't anything that makes this an experience that you don't want to have. If you're a horror fan and haven't played Dead Space, it's absolutely required. Dead Space was very well received critically. It holds an 89 on Metacritic for the Xbox 360 version of the game. Most critics responded well to its innovations in gameplay, but some criticized its use of elements that felt like padding. Dead Space was nominated for 10 awards at NAV GTR and won 6. It won Best Audio at the Game Developers' Choice Awards. It was nominated for 4 categories at the British Academy Games Awards and won 2. It was nominated for 4 categories at the DICE Awards and won 2. It was a critical success, that's for sure. Most of its praise really came from its sound design being highly regarded among the community. But Dead Space didn't do very well in sales. It reached number 10 in game sales on release in the US. Sales would improve over time due to its critical success, but it was considered a commercial disappointment due to its release, even with heavy marketing. Despite this, EA still decided to move forward with a sequel, mostly because of the first game's critical success. Dead Space 2 began its production almost immediately after the release of the first game. It was developed by Visceral Games, which was a rebranding of the original developers, EA Redwood Shores. It was again published by Electronic Arts. A year after Dead Space's release, Glenn Schofield, the creator and executive producer of the original game, left Visceral to start his own company with Michael Condrey, the director of Dead Space. They founded Sledgehammer Games and haven't looked back since. The team working on Dead Space 2 weren't worried, though. Executive producer Steve Papoudis said that it takes a lot more than 2 people to make a great game. The team's goal with the sequel was to create an improved version of the first game. They wanted to make it accessible to a wider audience and introduce some quality of life improvements to the series. They also wanted to introduce more action to the game. This decision was also influenced by new staff at Visceral and new creative decision makers. In this entry, the team also wanted to focus on the story a bit more. They decided to give Isaac a voice to make him more sympathetic to the audience. The art designer from the first game, Ian Milheim, returned. He was inspired by Gothic architecture to create the Unitologists' Cathedral in the game. This was meant to evoke and communicate the beliefs of the religions and also its worship of the marker itself. The character designs were influenced by the new area introduced, the Sprawl. This was a cityscape in space. Because of this, the new enemy designs reflected people turned in this area, creating many new types of necromorphs. The sound team again used real-world sounds that they would distort and incorporate into the game. They wanted to really focus and hone in on the sound design, improving it beyond the first game. Andrew Boyd, the chief audio director, noted the importance of sound design in horror, making it a point to balance this element for the game's horror component. Dead Space 2 was officially announced on December 7th, 2009. The game was shown off at E3 and a demo was showcased at Gamescom. EA really went all out on the marketing for the game, spending a total of $60 million on spreading the word of Dead Space 2. Dead Space 2 was released in North America for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Windows on January 25th, 2011. As always, a note before we get into things. In the previous video, I talked about the real story of Dead Space at the end of the video. This was due to the fact that a lot of the audio logs and text memos we find in the game will give us background information on the situation at hand. This information isn't necessary to the overall plot, but it does help us understand what led to this situation. Now, I won't be doing this for Dead Space 2. The reason is that a lot of the audio logs focus on smaller stories and just sort of fleshing out the attacks by the necromorphs. The other reason is that there's a lot of other media that explains what happens in between Dead Space 1 and 2, so I'll be covering this topic more extensively in the full retrospective. Here, I'm specifically referring to Dead Space Aftermath and Dead Space Salvage, an animated film and a graphic novel, respectively. I do also plan to cover the entire timeline and tie things up in the full retrospective once we get there. Before we actually start the game, I thought it important to note that in the menus there is a previously on Dead Space option, which gives us a little cinematic, recounting the events of Dead Space 1. Most of it's stuff we already know, but it does throw in some interesting background, particularly the point that humanity fled Earth in the 25th century because they ran out of resources. This was how the Planet Cracker ships were created, and the Ishimura was the first. Dead Space 2 starts with a video call between Nicole and Isaac, clearly before her death. She's telling her then-boyfriend about how much she loves her job aboard the Ishimura, but they're cut off. We pan out and Isaac is in some sort of interview. He's being questioned about his nightmares. He sees visions of Nicole beyond the desk. The man at the desk asks Isaac about the marker and what happened on the Ishimura, but Isaac can't answer these questions easily. He's clearly still suffering from hallucinations and delusions from the events of the first game. Some combination between PTSD from the event and the marker's influence still sticking in his mind. The sequence ends when Nicole jumps on the table and her face begins to glow. Dead Space 2 puts a much larger focus on the story. It definitely leans into the cinematic a lot more, and I honestly think it's one of the sequel's greatest strengths. It provides a much more cohesive narrative, improving on the little that there was to criticize with the first game. The visuals that are used to represent Isaac's visions are always great as well. There are these visceral, primordial, alien images, especially in reference to Nicole's light face. Isaac is woken up by someone named Franco. We're in a straitjacket, being rescued with little to no information. Franco is killed before we can get any more, turned into a necromorph in front of our eyes. We're connected to a woman who tells us to get the hell out of there, as we're chased down the halls by various necromorphs. We're in a straitjacket, so we can't fight back. This is a great design choice from a horror perspective. Disabling us and forcing us to get out as fast as possible increases the anxiety right from the beginning. We walk through the facilities, seeing the remnants of what the necromorphs have done in another room. We can see a man being interrogated on a monitor by the same guy who was interrogating Isaac. The man being pestered is named Nolan Strauss, and he's talking about the marker, how it was speaking to him. In the next room, we see the interrogator, who tries to slice Isaac's neck, but instead takes his binds off. He then puts the knife to his own neck. We gain a flashlight, which will be incredibly important in this entry. We get a video call from the woman before. Her name is Dana. She's trying to help us and tells Isaac that he has dementia from what happened on Aegis 7. She can cure him, but we have to get to her. We travel through some service ducts, and Dana tells us that we have to follow her path, because if Tideman finds us, we're dead, whoever that is. We find a man suspended above a table, but we hack the machine. From this, we gain the Kinesis module. This works very similar to Dead Space 1. We can lift objects and throw them, or just move them. Dead Space 2 places a much larger emphasis on using it in combat, though. There are poles placed around almost every room that we can fire at enemies as projectiles. This also gives us a backup option when we run out of ammo and are in a jam. We destroy some necromorphs with it and head into the next area. There, a man has a surgical laser on him and we have to deactivate it. We can't do it quickly enough to save him from the attacking necromorph, though. Either way, we get a plasma cutter from it, our first weapon of the game. It functions just like the last one, letting us dismember enemies with ease. Dead Space 2 uses the same system as its predecessor. Targeting limbs and cutting apart enemies will do much more damage and disable them. We eventually encounter Strauss in person, the man we saw interrogated before. He says he's patient 5 and asks if we remember him before being separated by some blast doors. We're accosted by waves of necromorphs, and Isaac fends them off. Dana tells us that they don't have to be friends, but she can help, and the two can work against Tideman. She says that we're on the Titan space station orbiting Saturn. She can't tell us any more, though, because her signal gets jammed. We hack another panel and get the stasis ability, again, very similar to the previous one. Stasis is another ability that's much more encouraged for combat use in this entry. It will slow enemies down, freezing them in time for a brief period. Most enemies in the game move much faster than before. Stasis is almost always necessary in combat, and it's incredibly hard to survive without it. Its functionality has also been slightly changed to be more of an area of effect skill rather than a single target one, affecting multiple enemies and slowing them at once. We're introduced to the Puker Necromorph. This is a new enemy type that will shoot projectile bile at us. If it hits us, it'll slowly damage Isaac, but also slow him. This can be incredibly annoying in battle and can get us swarmed easily. They're also particularly bothersome because it seems like the range on their attacks are very far. We can be hit from so far away. It's bad enough that we don't even see them before getting attacked sometimes. We continue following Dana's route and eventually come upon a residential area of the Titan station. The walls are covered in blood, there's balloons at the reception desk. This is one of the most eerie parts of Dead Space 2, is the variety in environments. Not only does it improve the atmosphere, extending the necromorph invasion to just your average living person, but it also creates a much better swath of levels that we can traverse. This is, of course, compared to the static and industrial halls of the USG Ishimura from the first game. Isaac enters a room and an oxygen tank explodes, causing the vacuum to rip everything out of the room. We have to shoot a lockdown button to prevent us from being ripped into space. We're allowed to use our first store at this point. These also function very similar to the first Dead Space. We can buy ammo, health packs, weapons, suit upgrades, or power nodes from the store. I did notice that credits seem to be given out more conservatively in this entry, though. Even with exploring every level as much as I could, it still felt like I didn't have enough credits to comfortably buy upgrades all the time. The suit upgrades that you can purchase will, just like the previous entry, upgrade armor and storage space, but in Dead Space 2, each suit also has unique modifiers as well. The security suit, for example, increases damage done with the pulse rifle by 5%. We get our first vacuum of this entry, a space with no sound or air. Here, again, our senses are deafened, making it difficult to spot enemies in the area. We also have to be conscious of our air to make sure we don't suffocate. In the area after, we encounter the tripod, another new enemy to Dead Space 2. It almost functions like a leaper, jetting at us with high speeds. We have to shoot the pods on its arms to dispense with it. When it's dead, Dana tells us to head to the tram station to get her. She tells Isaac he's been here for 3 years. He was brought to the station by Tideman, who found him floating through space. The marker put a self-replicating signal in his head, and it's spreading. He'll die if it isn't stopped. We crawl through another service vent to head to the next area, and this starts Chapter 2. Now, if you remember my video on the first Dead Space, each chapter was pretty formulaic in the way that it started. Isaac would head back to the tram station, take the shuttle to a new area, and begin the next chapter. Dead Space 2 handles this much better. There's really no common thread on when and where chapters begin. It's all a very seamless transition. It can start after we've crawled out of some ducts, been thrown by a powerful necromorph, or ran away from some gunships. This makes the story flow a lot better, and is just good pacing overall. This structure really reflects the way that modern games handle chapter separations. We get access to our first bench here, which will allow us to use power nodes found throughout the game or in shops to upgrade our weapons, rig, or stasis module. We can increase anything from air in our suit to reload speed or damage done by throwing objects with kinesis. This is virtually identical to Dead Space 1, except there's an increase in the amount of nodes for each upgradable equipment, and we can also respec for a fee of 5,000 credits. In the next area, we see a video of Tideman giving an evacuation order to everyone on the station, one that's looped and was given a while ago. We next enter a residential area of the station, necromorphs swarming the apartments and overrunning the place. We can hear people behind their doors screaming for help. It's a terrifying situation. We see a man impaled by a monster as we ride the elevator up, not able to save him. We see Strauss across the balcony. He says that someone gave them both drugs to erase their memories. We're attacked by a leaper before we can talk to him more. Trying to get into another area, the power goes out, and we're forced to fight waves of necromorphs in the dark. Now, I'm gonna say it. Dead Space 2 is dark. And I don't mean like tonally dark. Well, it kind of is that as well, but it's physically very dark. Much darker than Dead Space 1 by far. There were dark moments in Dead Space for sure, but they were used sparingly. I talked at length about how that game used light as an extra form of communication with the player. A language talking directly to the player's subconscious about whether to be scared or to breathe. Dead Space 2 is mostly dark. Like, a lot of the time, it's either dimly lit or just pitch black. We have to constantly be aiming to see where we're at because we can't see anything without the flashlight. Now, don't get me wrong, this does add some tension and fear into the game. Quite a bit, actually. But like I said, making the decision to not use this sparingly exhausts the usage of the dark as a scare tactic pretty early on. We get to a certain point where it doesn't even matter that we're in the dark because we're used to it. Like a cat. Each time a scare is used in a horror game, it becomes less and less effective. Now, I know what you're going to say, Dad. Dead Space 2 isn't a horror game. It's an action game. And I would be inclined to agree with you. But I don't think the developers did at the time the game was made. Sure, we can find interviews where they say they wanted to bump up the action, but they never said it was shifting genres entirely. Wikipedia lists it as a survival horror game. The Dead Space Wiki lists it as a survival horror game. Steam lists it in the horror and survival horror genres. The back of the box art totes that Dead Space 2 will bring the terror back to space. There was even a famous ad campaign for the game, Your Mom Hates Dead Space 2, that featured moms cringing at the violence and fear that the game presents.
I think it'll make a person become insane.
Because of that, I will be judging Dead Space 2 as a horror game with action elements, and by that sentiment, I suppose I should state my conclusion here. Dead Space 2 is a bad horror game. I'm sure you don't agree, but let me at least take some time across this video and tell you the reasons why. Before we get to that, we need to make our way through the story some more. Isaac weaves his way through the apartments and eventually gets to the other side. Dana tells Isaac that Tideman built another marker, the reason that the necromorphs are overrunning the sprawl. He begins having hallucinations, something Isaac will experience throughout most of the game. We see strange flashing images and noises coming from the screen, and eventually Nicole sitting on a bench. We have to make our way through the train as it rides to its next destination. Of course, defeating many necromorphs along the way. We have to use our boost boots to jet to another car, and eventually the car crashes, ejecting us from the bottom. We're hung by our feet upside down and have to shoot enemies coming at us. Very reminiscent of that famous scene from The Last of Us, even though this was released before The Last of Us. Dana updates our route since we definitely got jetted off of our original one. She's taking us through the Cassini Towers residential center. We enter a section of the station with stores, multiple toy shops, and kid-focused markets. We can hear laughs, the sounds of advertisements, and music boxes. The first half of the game has quite a few of these creepy environments, and it's something that it does pretty well. We're introduced to a new enemy reflective of this specific environment, the Pack. These are very weak necromorphs, gray and small. They resemble children that were infected. They're one of the most terrifying enemies in the sequel. They rush at us, trying to overwhelm rather than inflict damage by themselves. This can happen very easily, but they also die from one hit, so as long as we keep shooting into the horde, we can manage them. After we defeat them, Strauss contacts Isaac. He's paranoid and thinks they're tracking their signals. His memories are coming back. He's seeing symbols. Someone finds him and his video is cut off. We call Dana and she says Strauss was a patient as well, but he's crazy. He killed his wife and kid. We end up at a unitology recruitment center. Dana has routed us through this place so we can get to residential. We eventually reach some sort of maintenance hatch and get our first taste of boosting. Zero-G is much improved in Dead Space 2. No longer are we confined to jumping from wall to wall. We can now float through the air and fly wherever we like. This works much better for puzzle purposes and allows us much more freedom. We fly through a fan and end up in more apartments. This place is covered in unhinged scrawlings covering the walls, the same symbols, language, and marker that we saw on the Ishimura. The interesting thing about these symbols is that it's a real language the team created for Dead Space 1. These are actual writings and we can translate them because the language was decrypted ages ago. This one, for example, says convergence. This is a really cool touch to their world, causing the bigger fans of the series to delve deeper into the story to find things others wouldn't. Isaac enters a child's room with the shadows from a mobile spinning. He sees Nicole again. She disappears and Isaac is tracked by a gunship in the sky. Eventually, we arrive at the Unitologist Cathedral. We can find multiple podiums that will give us a backstory on the church and their reverence of a martyr named Michael Altman. Just before entering the main hallway, we're shot at by ships and have to seek refuge inside. The church is probably one of my favorite areas in the game. The environment is so well fleshed out and stylized. Just being in there gives us a better picture of the religion itself and also the world surrounding Dead Space in general. There's also this inherent fear we have based around grand Gothic buildings like this. Mixing the Gothic architecture with advanced future tech is also just an interesting spin that you don't get to see much. Isaac is contacted by Strauss again, who rambles on about the symbols some more. He says they have to work together, but gets distracted by someone. We find some church indoctrination videos and eventually have to solve a puzzle to get a door open. We almost get sucked out of a window, and if we don't hit the lockdown button, Isaac's arms get severed. We make our way through seeing more apparitions of Nicole speaking to us through the screens. Nicole eventually tries to impale Isaac with a syringe, but as she disappears, he realizes it was him trying to stab himself the whole time. Isaac is at a point where he's lost himself, lost his mind. He barely has control on reality, and these apparitions begin to make us question what is real and what isn't. Because we know what happened in Dead Space 1, we really have no way to trust Isaac as a narrator. It's this setup that makes us just as paranoid as the character that we're playing. We're introduced to these stalker necromorphs that are almost like small velociraptors. These enemies are quite annoying as well. They'll hide from us until they find an opening and charge. We have to wait patiently for them to come out of cover and try to defeat them as they run at us. Dana tells us to head through the crypt. She tries to tell us something important as well, but her signal is jammed. We head down into the crypt's strange freezer pods are full of bodies, and now those bodies are transformed, breaking out of their glass containers and attacking us. We find the exit, but we have to go straight up. We need to fix the gravity controls, slowing the machine below and pulling arms down to stop it. Isaac heads straight up and finally gets in contact with Dana again. She says that the people in the gunship are probably targeting both of them. We're attacked by another tripod and have to fight off massive waves of the pack. We finally get out of the church and meet with Dana, but she captures Isaac, revealing that she's a unitologist. She says that Isaac was brought here to build markers for them, and he built the one on the sprawl. She won't be curing him because they need him. Just then, a gunship tears apart Dana and her crew. Isaac claws his way into a maintenance hatch and falls down, barely escaping. Before he gets away, the Tormentor shows up, a massive necromorph that rips and tears through everything in its path. We have to shoot its pods as it tries to smash Isaac to bits. This is basically a much upgraded and advanced version of the drag tentacle. We're attacked by the gunship again and thrown out into space. The Tormentor rips apart the gunship and we blow it up, causing Isaac to be thrown into an apartment complex, starting Chapter 6. This is what I mean when chapter transitions are so much smoother. These huge action sequences are actually insanely well done. They're smooth, they're high-paced, fun, and intense. It really ramps up the stakes, and seeing Isaac barely claw his way out of the turmoil he's in is heart-pumping. Strauss contacts us. He wants to team up and destroy the marker. He's recalling something called the Steps, but Isaac doesn't remember these. Strauss is remembering his family again and gets distracted. We have to trust Strauss at this point because we have no other choice. He's our only ally. Our other one, Dana, was a traitor and she's dead. We're introduced to the cysts in the next area. These are small pods that shoot out explosive projectiles. They only shoot out one before dying, so we can easily take care of them by shooting them first. They don't target us, they're only activated when we walk close to them. These are literally the worst enemy in the game. I don't mind the concept overall, something that makes us pause and look around for the gurgling sound to make our way through the hallways, but they're placed in such cheap ways. They'll be put on the ceiling, in front of ammo boxes, or in front of power nodes on the wall, hidden. It's such a cheap way to damage and provide scares for the game. It's also really annoying getting knocked down multiple times in a hallway. They're just used too much, and it gets real old after the first couple of times. This also furthers the point that I'm trying to make. There's a lot of these cheap moments throughout Dead Space 2. The game does feel like it's trying to kill you through combat. It feels like it's working against you, not with you. Through the lens of a horror game, this seems cheap. Through the lens of an action game, not so much. It was at about this time in the game when I realized that I didn't like Dead Space 2 as a horror game. I think it's really a great action game. It does a lot to innovate, and the seamless transitions from area to area, the flowing story, the high intensity, all further that goal. But it feels like a devolution from Dead Space in the horror genre. The game feels like its foot is halfway out the door. They wanted to make an action game, but knew that fans were expecting horror, so they tried to do both. In that, I think they luckily succeeded in making a good action title, but failed at making a good horror. Dead Space 2 is also just a step up in difficulty from the first. Way more enemies are thrown at us. The necromorphs are much faster. Resources are actually in demand in Dead Space 2, seeing us constantly surviving on nothing. It's not that hard in comparison to some more prolific modern titles, but in comparison to the first, it is. When discussing the first game, I talked a lot about balance. Horror is a delicate balance, and everything has to be in place for it to work. This is because you're selling an illusion with horror. If the player can't buy into the illusion that they aren't playing a video game, then it isn't scary. The shocks don't work. The atmosphere can feel more like a haunted house than anything. The first game had a perfect balance, but Dead Space 2 doesn't inherit this from its predecessor. We're constantly thinking about health, ammunition, weapon upgrades, and credits. This is fine normally, and sure, we thought about this stuff in Dead Space as well, but not to this degree. When we're constantly focused on the mechanics because we're dying more than the first game, we've broken the illusion. We've realized that we're playing a video game, and playing a video game isn't inherently scary. Again, don't get me wrong here. Overall, Dead Space 2 is a good game, but it's not a good horror game. The fear that Dead Space presented was a good balance of anxiety and fear. The build-up to the monsters, jump scares were used sparingly. The anticipation was built slowly over the course of the game. The ending culminated in large battles, and when dozens of necromorphs were swarming at you in the final chapter, it felt real. Here, it feels like the action is pumped up to 11 from the very beginning. This leaves very little room for anticipation, suspense, or atmosphere. Just action. Isaac's next path is blocked by fire. We have to get rid of the oxygen in the room to get rid of the flames and make our way forward. We have to transport a battery through the vacuum and eventually get the elevator working. Strauss keeps talking about the steps, something that one of his hallucinations is telling him about. Step 1, he says, is crawling into the dark machine. We face a bunch more stalkers in an open room, and Strauss calls again. He says the steps will destroy the marker. Step 2 is the screws go tight all around. Nothing Strauss says makes sense. He very much fits the bill of what Dana told us, a psycho who we shouldn't trust. But it doesn't really matter. We have to at least use him for a little bit, until we can find someone else. Just then we see a woman shooting necromorphs, fighting for her life. She doesn't trust Isaac, and doesn't want to work together. She says her name is Ellie. Isaac offers to help, but she heads in the elevator and tells him not to follow. We're introduced to another type of necromorph, almost as terrifying as the pack. Crawlers. These are childlike necromorphs, crab walking on their hands and feet with huge pods on their stomach. Shooting their pods will kill them, but they explode on death, so we have to be distanced when we do it. Nicole shows up again, asking Isaac if he's in denial. Isaac thinks he's better than Strauss. He knows these are hallucinations, but Nicole tells him that his pain won't go away, even if he destroys the marker. One of the biggest disappointments in the game was the fact that the carousel in this room wouldn't spin when I used kinesis. Ellie has met Strauss, and she's weary of him, but Isaac tells her to work with him. She offers to take him to the hub. We reunite with the two who are upstairs. The power goes out, and Tideman contacts Isaac. He shut down the train and life support. He says they can't recover the place, so he can't allow anyone to escape, including Ellie and Isaac. We're attacked by a brute who mostly functions the same as the first game. They're a little different, though, in that they have pods on their shoulders that we have to destroy. No more stasis and attacking the back. When we defeat it, Isaac tells Ellie what their goal is, to destroy the marker. She's forced to help because they need to get the life support systems online or they're all dead. We have to fix the solar arrays to get the power back online. Before we get further into the story, I'd like to talk about how the weapons have changed in Dead Space 2. There's a lot of similarities from the previous game. We have a wealth of weapons to choose from as long as we have the credits to buy them. We can equip 4 at once, and there's a lot of repeats from the previous entry. We still have the plasma cutter, obviously, the line gun, the plasma rifle, and the Ripper that we talked about in the last video. I decided not to stress myself out in this entry though, and avoided the Ripper at all costs, learning my lesson. I did use the plasma cutter, plasma rifle, and the line gun quite a bit. They're all really good and function basically the same as before. My fourth weapon was a bit more variable throughout my playthrough of Dead Space 2 though, because I couldn't find anything that worked great in that spot. I used the Seeker rifle quite a bit, which is more of a long-range, one-shot weapon that can do a bunch of damage as long as you're accurate. I also used the detonator, which allows you to plant mines around an area and enemies explode when they're tripped. Both were pretty good and had a lot of functionality, but when I was in a tight situation, I felt like I needed something better. There's also the flamethrower, which I used a lot during the DLC, which we'll be talking about at the end of the video. The flamethrower does a pretty decent amount of damage and is actually good in a pinch. The weapon variety is just as good as the previous game. We have a lot of weapons to choose from, each that feels like it's made for a particular group of enemies or situations. One nitpick that I really didn't like was the static reticle. In Dead Space, the aiming for the weapons was actually a light that was cast on wherever you were aiming. You could see how the light was overlaid on the enemy you were aiming at. Here, the reticle is just circles that are stuck on the screen. I really liked the dynamic reticle from before. It actually felt a lot more in-world, which I think was a much larger focus in the first game than this one. I know it's a small thing to be talking about, but it really bummed me out to see it changed. Isaac has to repair an elevator using a thrust canister. These are small pods that we can place on equipment, and shooting the bottom of them will cause them to propel the object forward. This is a puzzle mechanic, not just an item that we can use wherever, which would be cool. Strauss is giving Ellie issues because he won't stop mumbling. We go through a ridiculously intense sequence with multiple large enemies trying to crawl into the elevator as it's propelled upwards. We have to fend them off until we reach our destination. We reach the array station, but it's locked out for someone named Howard Phillips. If we read the text log in the next room over, we can find out that he lived here. His body is actually still here, and we can use it to get into the door. I loved this little puzzle. I thought it was such a genius idea. The game doesn't really tell us we need to do this either. It's not insanely hard to figure out, but it was one of those situations where, when I was trying it, I didn't think it was actually going to work, and then it did. There's a bunch of text logs that we can find to actually learn more about Howard's time on the station and his love of birds. We have to make it through the array system. Part of that is solving a fuse box puzzle. We have to crawl through vents to 2 separate rooms and arrange the fuses in the correct order. This is mostly randomly placing fuses until they're lit up green. I suppose I should quickly talk about the Peng Easter egg in Dead Space because it'll definitely come up again. This is a running joke throughout the Dead Space games. I didn't talk about it in my previous video, but towards the end of the game, we can find a hidden statue that we can kinesis pull towards us and pick up. This is the Peng treasure and can be sold for a ton of credits at the store. In Dead Space 2, this returns. In this fuse room, we can arrange the fuses so that they are lit up blue, which will allow us to move the maintenance shaft and crawl to an extra room. In here, we find a bunch of power nodes and another Peng statue. It's not really clear exactly what Peng is. There's posters for it throughout the games as if it's some sort of product, but I couldn't find any definitive answer. It's probably just an in-joke at the studio and is left purposefully ambiguous. Because it's in every game, though, I thought it was worth noting here. Correctly placing the fuses allows us to find the mainframe circuits, which we have to destroy. Now the solar arrays need realigned, but Strauss is freaking out, screaming that he isn't ready for the needle again. We see Nicole again, asking Isaac how he holds everything inside. We head out into space and have to take control of the solar arrays, aligning them with each other to get the power back online. We have to fight a nest necromorph. These will always bother us when we're in 0G. They shoot seeking projectiles at us that do a pretty good bit of damage, and the only way to kill them is to destroy their pods. We align the panels and the beam almost hits Ellie and Strauss. The necromorphs are making their way to the transport hub. Isaac and the crew have to get there before the monsters do, or their transportation will be destroyed. Isaac uses an escape pod to hurtle himself through the sky, down into the sprawl. We have to bob and weave through space debris, and eventually Isaac makes a messy landing. Ellie and Strauss are upstairs, but the place begins to explode. We have to run while Ellie and Strauss take refuge in the factory. Ellie laments the fact that she was in the same place this morning with her crew. She was a CEC officer working for the same company that Isaac once did. She feels like they're making no progress, but Isaac focuses on the task at hand. They have to regroup. She gives us a route to the central hub. We eventually find the two of them separated by glass. The door's jammed, of course. We have to make our way through the processing plant to meet up with them. We have an awesome sequence where we have to float through zero-G and use thrusters to open doors. We have to avoid all kinds of machinery threatening to slice us in half. Tideman finds our location, trying to kill us again by activating the equipment we have to get around. When talking to Ellie, we hear Strauss telling her she has to follow the steps before the both of them are attacked by necromorphs. We eventually get through the tunnels, and we see a transmission of Strauss hounding Ellie about Step 3. We finally meet up with Ellie and Strauss in person. Strauss won't stop talking about the 4 steps, but he won't tell us what Step 4 is. We have to get to the industrial transport so we can make it to the government center. We have to physically deploy the tram, and Nicole confronts Isaac again.
Why'd you come looking for me if you knew I was dead, Isaac? Did you think I would forgive you?
Get out of my head. You're not Nicole!
Ellie and Strauss arrive, and the 3 of them take the tram out. On the ride, Isaac sees the Ishimura. Ellie tells him that everyone on board died because of a terrorist attack, but Isaac tells her what really happened on the ship. Something blocks the track, and we have to get off the tram. We find a huge mass blocking it. There's large pods of nitrogen chloride, which we can overheat by tossing red flammable canisters at them. We have to set the one at the bottom off, but we're swarmed by enemies. This is kind of an intense moment because we have to dodge and get away from the enemies while also blowing up the tank. The entire place explodes, but we make it onto the tram just in time. Tideman contacts Isaac again. He's going to use the solar beam to attack them. He cuts the tracks off, and the only way to get across is to use the gravity tethers from the Ishimura. We're forced to go back through the ship. Seeing all these old areas covered in white plastic, ladders littering the hallways is odd. Walking through the hallways, we constantly feel like we're going to be assailed by enemies at any given moment, but for quite a while, we aren't. There's a lot of time to build up tension here, and it's honestly one of my favorite parts of the game. But eventually this is undercut when we walk down a large pathway and the waves start coming. We fight off tons of powerful necromorphs, and the intensity doesn't stop from there. I guess my real problem with Dead Space 2 as a horror game is its level of intensity. A horror game needs real, genuine time to build its atmosphere. Not only that, but it needs time for the player to anticipate the horror that's to come. If there's no anticipation, then the horror that's arrived is defunct. It means nothing because it's just another enemy on the screen. My main problem with Dead Space 2 is that it gives no time for the player to anticipate the horror. Horror works best when the intensity is slowly increased and decreased over time, causing the player to feel true anxiety in the most intensive situations. When your level of intensity and combat is bumped up to 11 from the very start, there's no going back. The seal has been broken. You can't return to try and build the atmosphere up again. And this is all because of the elephant in the room, that Dead Space 2 is truly an action game. The developers sold it as a horror, and maybe they wanted to make a horror game, but they ended up making an action game because they thought it would improve sales, which the first game didn't have. And as an action game, Dead Space does work. It's incredibly intense, the pace is high, the storytelling is fantastic and fluid, but it just doesn't work in the context of horror, especially when we look at its predecessor. We fight down a long hallway of enemies and eventually arrive back in the very familiar halls of the Ishimura, returning to many of the familiar places that we visited in the first game. We even come back through the decontamination chamber from the first entry, and in the biggest troll ever, as we're waiting for monsters to pop out of the vents, a repeat of last time, nothing happens. It's a fantastic subversion of expectations and genuinely makes us worry for quite a while, waiting for the impending doom. We're attacked by tons of enemies and have to fix the centrifuge that we did last time, only now we have to place circuit boards on top of the thing. In comparison, it's a much better puzzle, and I can really only view this as Dead Space 2 flexing its upgraded puzzle mechanics for this new entry. There's an interesting bit where we get attacked by the drag tentacle from the first game, but it turns out to be a vision. This brings into question what Isaac is imagining because of the marker, and what is actually PTSD because of his time on the Ishimura. The whole hallucination thing in general could just be a metaphor for PTSD overall. When we head back through the decontamination chamber, we are attacked, and we have to backtrack to make our escape. Ellie is getting worried by Strauss because he keeps talking to his kid who isn't alive. He attacks her with a screwdriver and we're cut off from their columns. We take the tram and Ellie says that Strauss bit her. The tram is stopped because of an obstruction ahead. In the room where we first met the hunter in Dead Space 1, we see the video of Nicole that was heavily featured in the first game. We eventually get the rail lined back up and alert Ellie. After we get the gravity tethers online, Ellie gets the tram going, and Tideman chides us for it. We head into an escape pod, but Nicole's apparition tries to stop us. Ellie contacts us again, and Strauss attacks her with a screwdriver again. The escape pod crashes, and we see strange visions of Nicole in front of the red marker. As we wake up, Strauss is holding a screwdriver to Ellie's eye. When we head through the facility we crashed into, Strauss tells us he showed Ellie step 3. He says they're afraid of him because he was going to destroy the marker. We head through a mining facility and Strauss shows that he's cut Ellie's eye out, but she attacks him and we're cut off the two as they fight. Isaac is whipped out into space by some creature, and Ellie says that Strauss has escaped into the mines. We're in the vacuum of space and have to get 2 intersecting lasers out of the way. We have to use the thrusters to move the lasers out of the doorway. When we get inside, Ellie says she has something Isaac will want to see, and on top of that, Strauss is after him. Strauss attacks us in the mines and we have to stab him in the head. Shortly after, Nicole attacks us. Step 4 is acceptance. We reunite with Ellie. She found a massive drill that will get us through to the other side. Isaac says that Strauss was running away from his guilt, but Isaac isn't running anymore, seemingly overcoming his feelings about Nicole. We repair the drill and use it to head out, but we get swarmed on top by dozens of necromorphs. Eventually, Ellie crashes the thing and we're ejected. Ellie thinks that the marker is close, in the government sector. We make our way to Ellie and she boards a ship, but Isaac locks her in it, telling her to get out and save herself.
Are you ready to talk now?
Why? So I can let you go too? I can't do that, Nicole. I never wanted to let you go.
A lot happened that we never wanted. Isaac, touch me.
I don't think that's a good idea.
Isaac, please. Make us whole.
Nicole wants to be whole again, but we head down to destroy the marker. Tideman has 200 men waiting for us, ready to shoot Isaac down. He's not lying either, because as we enter the next area, his men shoot at us, causing us to have to run into a side passage. We turn off the power and his men are fed to the necromorphs. Nicole begins to help us at this point. She wants to show us the way to the marker. Since we've come to terms with our guilt, she's assisting us. Nicole says that we'll know what to do when the time comes. We finally see the marker. The convergence is at hand. Thousands of necromorphs are swarming at the artifact. Tideman says that he spent years looking through Isaac's head. They were supposed to understand the marker. The artifact begins to activate. They didn't expect this many bodies, though, and Nicole takes us away to make us whole again. She leads us to a machine that will remove the marker codes from our head. These were the steps that Strauss was telling us about. We have an absolutely insane sequence where we have to plunge a needle into Isaac's eye. Nicole disappears and tells Isaac to follow the light, to head to the marker. Just then, the Ubermorph shows up. This is the successor to the Hunter from Dead Space. It can't be killed, just dismembered before regenerating and slowed down with stasis. We have to stun it and hack the panel to get out of the room. We run through the halls, stopping the Ubermorph wherever we can, and have to navigate some fiery zero-G. Nicole tells us to let go, and we enter the final stretch of the game. The Ubermorph is chasing us all the way, and we have to run from tons and tons of different necromorphs. We eventually find the light, but Tideman shoots Isaac with 2 javelins. Isaac disarms him and ends Tideman. Nicole takes Isaac into her arms. She tells him, "It's time to die." And suddenly we're transported somewhere else. The makers of the marker need to be absorbed. Isaac is the last body they need for the convergence. This is our final boss battle. Nicole was tricking us yet again. Here we have to shoot this shade that looks like Nicole. Shooting her enough will open up the marker and we can damage it. All the while, tons of shades that look like the pack are rushing at us, trying to kill us. Doing enough damage to the core will eventually destroy the marker. Isaac is back to normal, but the sector is collapsing around him. He sits down and accepts his fate, until Ellie calls him. She's coming back to save him. We have to fly up to the ship. The two narrowly escape, and we get a scene very similar to Dead Space's ending. But when Isaac looks over, it's just Ellie, showing that the marker codes are gone from his brain. Not only that, but he's gotten past his guilt. He's left those things in the past, and he's moved on. After the credits, we hear an audio conversation from the Overseer. He's being informed of the destruction of Marker Site 12. He says the other sites will have to pick up the pieces, telling us that there are many more markers out there than we think. Before we talk about my final thoughts on Dead Space 2, I'd like to quickly talk about the Severed DLC. This was a very short piece of downloadable content that was released on March 1st, 2011. It was only available for the console versions of the games. The DLC runs parallel to Isaac's story, though only the beginning of it. It actually surrounds a character that showed up in an earlier spin-off game called Dead Space Extraction, which we'll be talking about in the full retrospective. The man's name is Gabe Weller and is the protagonist of this expansion. Weller was on a patrol in the Titan mines when the outbreak happened. His squad was wiped out and now he's searching for his girlfriend, Maxine. He gets orders from Tideman to scrub the facilities and is eventually betrayed by his superior officer, Victor Bartlett. Victor was ordered to kill Gabe's girlfriend and he has to take out Gabe because he knows he'll never let it stand. The reason for her being targeted is that she was involved in something called the Oracle Project. Apparently they were studying Lexine because she seemed to be immune to the outbreak in some way. Gabe and Lexine were both on Aegis 7 and were some of the only survivors. Gabe eventually tracks down his wife, who's being carried away by 2 men in white lab coats. Lexine makes her escape onto a ship and the 2 men are killed. Gabe tries to board the ship with her, hacking the panel to unlock an airlock, but Victor shows back up and uses a grenade to destroy them both. Gabe's leg is severed, and he uses his last moments to save Lexine, defending himself long enough to open the airlock for her. We see that Gabe's body was collected for study, and Lexine is still on the run. The short DLC was actually pretty good. It's much more action-heavy than Dead Space 2, especially because it's so short in length. It's forced to put the pressure on right away because the whole thing is only about an hour and a half long. The story itself, though, was kind of shocking. I was genuinely surprised to see that the main character just died at the end. It was something I wasn't really expecting. The DLC did have a fair amount of bugs, though, especially the end scene where, after the credits, I just got stuck in the main room with no enemies or interactables. Overall, like I've said plenty of times now, I don't think Dead Space 2 works as a horror game. It's a fantastic action game, though. It's very well paced, the intensity is high throughout the entire game. We're always fighting off hordes of enemies, getting attacked by huge beasts, and flying through the air. Its constant and relentless pace makes us feel like we're always being chased, always being hunted. The new seamless transitions into chapters make the game and its story feel much smoother, rather than disconnected levels that we have to travel to. Speaking of the story, it's also greatly improved in this entry. Its themes of PTSD, guilt, and grief are very well done. This specter of Nicole that haunts us throughout the game is both terrifying as a real monster in the world, but also as a representation of Isaac's inability to let go of what once was. In the end, I don't really think Dead Space 2 was for me. I want to be honest with how I feel about this game. I know a lot of people enjoyed this entry, but I was expecting something completely different. I wanted more of what we got in Dead Space. I'm aware that a lot of the things that came from the first entry do reappear in the second. The innovations on the horror formula are mostly still there, but having the same ingredients doesn't mean that you're going to get the same result. There are many other variables that go into baking a cookie. The atmosphere just wasn't there for me this time around, and it really felt like the balance was off. I say this again just to reiterate, Dead Space 2 is a good game. I just don't think it succeeds as a horror. I do want to give Dead Space 2 some genuine credit, though. There are a lot of things it does that I think greatly influenced action games for years, even to this day. You can see in the large interactive action sequences where modern action games have pulled from Dead Space 2 with regards to inspiration. There's a ton going on here, and Dead Space 2 would persist for quite a while. It has a really strong legacy that it's affected gaming for the better. It's not the first game to have done these things, but it's one of the ones that really pushed it up and made audiences see the full breadth of what these cinematic sequences could do for games. Dead Space 2 really is a much more cinematic version of the first game. It's not that the plot is easier to follow, it's just meatier than the first game. Dead Space was a little lacking in its actual story. It was mostly a tale about Isaac running around the ship and trying to save the Ishimura before eventually finding out about the marker. Dead Space 2 gets the reward of dealing with Isaac as a character more, since he can actually speak. There are a lot of small changes, quality of life ones, that really increase the overall feel. Being able to see our ammunition when switching weapons, being able to do more than one melee attack in a row without a huge delay in between animations. There's a lot here that Dead Space 2 improves on, but judging it as a horror game, it doesn't carry that same punch. As we said before, EA had spent a ton of money on marketing for Dead Space 2. They really wanted it to be a success, more than the previous entry was, because if you remember, they considered that one a disappointment. The critical reviews were, again, great. It carries a 90 out of 100 on Metacritic for the Xbox 360 version of the game. Reviewers loved the improved protagonist, the increased cinematic elements to the game, and the sound design. The marketing also seemed to have paid off because Dead Space 2 shipped 2 million units in its first week of release. It was selling at a ratio of 2-to-1 when compared to the first game. It was the third best-selling game of the month in January, just behind Black Ops 2 and Just Dance. But this didn't last long, and the production budget was so much higher for the second game that combined with the marketing budget, the game was still a commercial failure. Despite all that, EA decided to move forward with a third game in the franchise. It would be the final one in the mainline series. Dead Space 3 was again developed by Visceral Games and published by Electronic Arts. The game itself was almost cancelled due to the low sales from the previous entry. Instead of cancelling the game, they decided to move forward with production but change some things. The team decided to further push the action elements introduced in Dead Space 2. This was done as what they called a necessary evil to increase game sales. The game's director, Ben Wanat, wanted to return the game to its horror roots. EA wasn't so keen on this idea, though. They were more focused on chasing trends and getting the sales up for the series. Fans of the series had been asking for a co-op mode for the next Dead Space. The team's original idea was to include a co-op mode where the other player could control a shadow Isaac that would appear to be a hallucination. EA rejected this proposal and wanted a more traditional co-op mode, which removed the horror elements. Wanat wanted to focus on the story in this entry, much more than the previous games had. Most of the team knew this entry would be the last, so they wanted to conclude the narrative. Not only that, but they wanted to flesh out the world of the series. This had truly begun in Dead Space 2, with a lot more lore being provided. Dead Space 3 aimed to really give a definitive timeline to the universe. The team again focused on sound design and art. The scenarios and levels were designed more to build tension now, though, rather than an anxiety or horror-driven fear. Overall, it seems the team wanted to make a different game than EA did. This left them with not a lot of options, and eventually they were forced to make a title that would try to capture the market at that time. Dead Space 3 was first announced at E3 2012. The trailer, clearly focusing more on the action and co-op elements, had some fans worried that the series had ditched its horror roots. Dead Space 3 was released in North America for the PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Microsoft Windows on February 5th, 2013. Dead Space 3 begins with a bit of backstory. This intro cutscene serves as our previously on, but also seeks to flesh out the story around the markers a little further and more definitively. 300 years ago, the black marker was discovered under the Gulf of Mexico on Earth. The details of the disaster that followed were covered up, but Unitology was created around the time, worshipping the marker itself. Humans then fled Earth due to lack of resources. Mankind tried to recreate the markers in an attempt to harness the limitless resources it produced. As we know, this went terrible. The marker copies were buried and forgotten. This is when the USG Ishimura unearthed the red marker on Aegis 7, and the events of Dead Space and subsequently Dead Space 2 took place. Since then, Isaac still has a marker-touched mind, which still has the ability to destroy the markers or build them. The last thing we hear from this section is that there's hope. On an icy planet, years ago, someone managed to stop a marker uprising, which could be the key to stopping them altogether. We begin the prologue on this icy planet, June 18th, 2314. We play this prologue as another character entirely, Tim Kaufman. He's a soldier that's been sent to the planet Tau Volantis to recover a device called the Codex. Kaufman is lost in the snow and finds a wrecked ship. He's attacked by necromorphs that, yes, now have weapons, which, trust me, we'll talk about soon. He finds the Codex and rappels down the side of the mountain. At the bottom, he's confronted by General Mahad. The search for the Codex began because the device could supposedly stop an outbreak in the city. Mahad takes the device, kills Kaufman, deletes the information on the Codex, and takes his own life. The story jumps ahead 200 years to 2514 on the New Horizons lunar colony. Isaac has been living on the colony for the past 3 years, hiding away from EarthGov. He's been living with and dating Ellie Langford from the last game. It seems that has recently ended, though, because we're currently hearing a message from her saying that she's moved on. Just then, Robert Norton and John Carver burst in, telling Isaac that Ellie needs his help for another mission dealing with the markers. Before he can explain, the colony is attacked by Unitologists, and the group has to head out. Before we leave, we can find a personal journal of Isaac's, detailing that he lost part of his soul on the Titan Sprawl. Oh, and Ellie also got a replacement for her eye. The soldiers say that they're from the EarthGov's last battalion. We head out towards the escape car and Unitologists attack. We have to fight them off. Yes, that's right, we're fighting human enemies in this entry. One of them martyrs themselves, destroying the car and throwing Isaac into a nearby building. The Unitologists are specifically looking to kill Isaac, probably because he has the ability to destroy the markers. We're forced to make our way through the sewers and back up onto the streets. Ellie was the one that thought Isaac could stop this grand plan of convergence that the Unitologists were planning, but now she's gone missing. Isaac fights through many soldiers, crashes the flow of unmanned transports, and we see a message from Jacob Arthur Danick, the leader of the inner circle of Unitologists. He claims the black marker will lift humanity out of its miserable existence, the same things that the cult has been spouting for ages. Danick has gone after EarthGov because they experimented with the markers, which the church consider holy. Isaac is eventually shot by Unitologists and captured by Danick. He shows Isaac as he deactivates the security measures in the marker test lab at the center of the colony, wiping most of the settlement out. Before he shoots our protagonist in the head, Isaac escapes and falls down below. We fight off rooms of necromorphs, and eventually Norton contacts us again. Isaac tells him the extraction team is dead. Norton is going to pick up Isaac with the USM Eudora. We solve a very simple train puzzle to get the thing online. We have to run along the train, defeating Unitologists as we go, and eventually jump onto the Eudora itself. As you can probably tell so far, Dead Space 3 has a drastically different tone and play style to the previous games. We're fighting human enemies. Necromorphs have weapons. We're using cover in the environment. The game has gone full action, and you'll be hard-pressed to find very many actual horror moments in its entire playtime. There are a few spots here and there where it seems they snuck in some small scares or tried their hand at contributing to the atmosphere, but most of that is broken when we're in pseudo-cyberpunk cities jumping on trains and shooting generic soldiers. Dead Space 3 has gone so far in the other direction that it's wild. It's shocking to compare this game, which almost feels like a bland, nameless third-person action game from the early 2010s, to the balanced, interesting, and unique horror masterpiece that was Dead Space. It's a complete bastardization of the original concept of the game. I should note here that I'm not opposed to game series changing their genres throughout. This can be a way to shake up the franchise itself and keep things fresh. It can also be a huge subversion of expectations or a way to break new ground. Not very many series do this. It's not very conventional, but I don't think this was in the favor of trying something new. This was in favor of chasing trends, and you can see it all over the game. On top of the switch to a bland action game, Dead Space 3 also has a multitude of other problems with design and gameplay that we'll surely get into. The bottom line is that Dead Space 3 is barking up the wrong tree. The whole game definitely isn't just generic enemies. We will be fighting necromorphs soon, but this blatant appeal to a wider audience is honestly disrespectful to the franchise itself. I always get worried whenever I'm researching a game and see that the studio wanted to appeal to a wider audience. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but EA's motivation here was clearly to get sales up, not to get more people playing their series, but to appeal to more people. EA would have forced the team to make whatever game they thought would sell at the time. So they took a franchise that they already had and conformed it to the trends in gaming at the time. Isaac wakes up on the Eudora with Carver, who is very blunt. His child and wife were killed by Danik, and it's obvious he wants revenge. We learn from Norton that Ellie and her team shock traveled to another planet that supposedly held the secret to stopping the markers. There's a strange new type of collectible in Dead Space 3, the Artifact. These are virtually just text logs that are given a different name. If you collect all of them, you get the flight suit and an achievement. I wish they would have done a little more with these. Making each artifact unique would have been nice. A lot of games will make each collectible have a story behind it and be a child's toy or a special jacket or something. There's only 4 types of artifacts. In the end, they're really just an incentivized text log, and it's extra odd because text logs also exist in the game. The Eudora shocks into the Tau Volantis system, but they immediately suffer damage from mines and debris around the planet. Isaac has to escape, being thrown around the ship and eventually putting a suit on. We unlock an escape pod and get the crew free, being forced to jet away from the ship, dodging mines and large debris. The pod docks itself on a ship, the CMS Roanoke, that's been mostly obliterated. As they arrive, they're getting a signal from Ellie, an SOS deep inside the ship. Isaac decides to seek it out. When Isaac gets inside, he finds a bench and we're introduced to the overhauled weapon system. Before we get too much further into the story, I'd like to talk about the combat and weapons of Dead Space 3, because there's a lot of changes to the system overall. First of all, as we've talked about before, necromorphs have weapons. I'm not really in favor of this change overall. The necromorphs that do have weapons feel cheap, generic, and bland. The first time I saw them, it just felt like they were pulled from some other franchise, one that deals primarily with zombies. Their appearance, for the most part, also removes quite a lot of the interest in design that existed in the previous games. A lot of the praise for the enemy designs in Dead Space originated from the fact that they were alien in nature, grotesque humans that had been warped, and a complete distortion of the human form. Now, not every necromorph looks like a basic human enemy, and some of the basic human ones with weapons will also transform into things like a pair of legs with spiked appendages sprouting from the top. I just think the presentation for a lot of this game is pretty generic. We also have to face human enemies now, which we talked about previously. Much of the systems have stayed pretty much the same. We still have kinesis, which will allow us to grab objects and manipulate or throw them. This is used mostly for puzzles in this game, and I didn't find much use for it in combat. Stasis, on the other hand, is basically a must-have when playing through the entirety of Dead Space 3. Enemies are much faster in this entry, and slowing them down is paramount to surviving the massive hordes of necromorphs that we'll face. Other than that, the bench system has been greatly overhauled. We no longer just place nodes into circuits to upgrade stats on our weapons. Now we have a whole crafting system at our disposal. This is actually surprisingly intricate and was one of my favorite parts of the game. Here we can craft entirely new items, either from pre-planned blueprints or by combining parts that we found out in the wild. These can create all kinds of wild combinations. We can add modifiers to each weapon to determine how much or what kind of damage it does, like acid or flame. Certain attachments can even increase the power of our stasis or recharge our health. We can also add circuits to each of our weapons to increase the damage, reload, clip, or rate of fire. Some of these can have drawbacks though, decreasing other stats in the process. Each weapon is split into an upper and lower half, the upper being the primary fire and the lower half being the secondary fire. We can create line guns with a flamethrower as the secondary fire or any combination you can think of. It's actually a pretty interesting system once you get the hang of it. The only problem I found with it is that it was incredibly unintuitive. I didn't understand from the get-go how this all worked. This isn't the fault of the tutorial, because even if something walked me through the whole system, I still think it would have taken me some time to understand. The way the UI is set up, which for the record looks god-awful, makes everything seem pretty confusing and difficult to understand until you actually begin using it. The only downside to this whole thing is that we're downgraded to 2 weapons in this entry instead of 4. I mostly used the plasma cutter with a secondary fire of the flamethrower. This thing was pretty reliable the whole time, and being able to switch to the flamethrower in a pinch when I was overwhelmed helped out a lot. My other weapon switched out quite a bit, but was mostly a shotgun with an acid attachment that burned enemies after shooting them. This whole system creates a large amount of variety in each playthrough, depending on what weapons you choose to fight off the necromorph horde. The only negative thing I have to say is that I just wish this system was in a better game. We can still put upgrades to our health, stasis, armor, and rig by entering a suit kiosk. This is closer to the original bench that we've become accustomed to from the first 2 games. We use resources to upgrade nodes, increasing our health, armor, or different attributes dealing with our kinesis or stasis. We can switch suits in this entry, but they're strictly cosmetic, not providing the attributes that they did in previous games. We make our way through the ship and eventually find the generator room. The SOS is coming from right above, but we have to activate the machine itself first. We have to use kinesis to interact with the machine on 3 sides, all while dealing with enemies rushing at us. Upstairs, we reunite with Ellie and Norton, only to realize they're in a relationship. We also meet Santos and Buckle, who are a part of Ellie's team. Ellie says that the admiral of the ship had written marker scrawls all over her walls, and she thinks the answer to this situation is in her cabin. Ellie calls shortly after, and Isaac confronts her about her relationship with Norton. He objects, but he doesn't have a choice. He has to work with them. We enter another room where we have to complete the same generator puzzle as before, but now with tentacles involved. There's a few different hacking puzzles in Dead Space 3. I guess they were trying to diversify their electronics interface. The first one we encounter sees us having to move either analog stick to different spots of the board and holding the triggers to activate circuits in time. It's a small upgrade in puzzle variety, but nothing that I have too many feelings about. Isaac arrives at the Admiral's cabin and meets up with Carver, but Isaac gets lost in the scrawlings.
Ellie, Carver, reach the Admiral's quarters. Isaac's.
Turn it off.
Hey, Isaac!
Turn
Isaac? Carver, what's going on?
it off.
Isaac! Hey!
Turn it off.
Hey!
What is it? What's going on?
Nothing. Everything's fine. Everything's fine. Ellie, the Admiral was obsessed with making a key.
A key to what?
Hey! A key to what?
Some sort of alien device.
The Admiral discovered a key to a device that could control the markers. Ellie thinks that Tau Volantis is the marker homeworld and wants to regroup in the control room. Norton wants to leave, but Ellie protests, wanting to head to Tau Volantis. We encounter Ellie again, and she's found a maintenance shuttle that could get them off the ship. Norton contacts Isaac to try and get him on his side, to try and convince the team to leave the system. Isaac finds the small maintenance shuttle that allows him to travel quickly to different parts of the system. This introduces a new concept to the Dead Space world, a pseudo-open world design. We'll see some results of this new design later, but we do have a certain control over where we go in the game, at least for the beginning portion of it. We get our first side quest here, one of 10 in total, 3 of which are relegated to co-op, and 7 of which can be done solo. These side missions are not a terrible idea overall, especially for an action game, but their execution is pretty poor. For me to talk about the side missions, I first have to talk about the way that Dead Space 3 handles enemies. One of the worst parts of Dead Space 3 was how it handled enemy encounters. They take a ridiculous amount of time. Especially large groups of enemies will see us standing in a spot, defeating tons of waves, and then waiting endlessly for more to trickle in. The game just throws waves and waves of necromorphs at us. We might even think the battle is over at specific points, but most of the time, we're wrong. There are more enemies that are going to come through the vents, the windows, the maintenance shafts. Most large combat encounters see us standing at one end of the room waiting for more enemies to come at us, defeating those, and waiting for more. It's a ridiculous amount of enemies, and I'm honestly not sure why they upped the amount this much. Because the variety in enemy types hasn't really increased, it really makes each enemy type feel generic and overused. We see the same enemies so many times, even in each area. They get tired and trite. It's an incredible overusage of the necromorphs, and before, I never thought I could get tired of these enemy designs, but here we are. One other nitpick that I have about the combat system, now that we're on that subject, is that the ammo has been incredibly simplified. No longer is there separate ammo for each weapon in the game. Every type of ammo that we pick up is just called ammo clip by the game. This ammo works for all weapons across the board. I'm sure this was a lazy way of making ammunition work with their new weapon crafting system, but they definitely could have separated ammo into different types, considering there's only a certain amount of cores that you can use for your weapons, determining what type of ammunition they would fire. It's just a really lazy way of simplifying the game overall, and is a significant downgrade in my opinion. Now that we've established how enemy encounters, especially large ones, are conducted, we can talk about side quests. Side quests are pretty formulaic. You usually get a key or some sort of text log that directs you to a place that holds some sort of cache. This means extra ammunition or upgrade materials. Entering this area will see us finding most of this side story through text logs or audio communications, and it's generally the same thing across the board. Some sort of organization has been infiltrated by the necromorphs, and they left behind equipment that we can salvage. We make our way through the area and eventually have to fight off waves and waves of enemies before getting it. The only reason I brought up the generic way that the game handles enemy waves before is because side quests are where it's at its worst. These final rooms before we get our loot is most of the time where we're inundated with waves and waves of the same enemies over and over, just causing us to shoot and shoot repeatedly, standing in the same corner for 10 minutes until we can get our reward. The whole thing feels very hollow and uninspired. We eventually head onto the Terra Nova, a derelict ship that contains a shuttle. Isaac tries to retrieve the shuttle because it can take them down to the planet's surface. Isaac locates the shuttle inside the ship. It's in the aft station. While traversing the station, we find our first scavenger pod. These are little tools that we can place around different areas to scrounge up resources for us. They can only be placed in certain spots, though. We'll hear an audio cue when heading through an area and be able to place the bot. After a while, we can pick the bot back up at the bench and get some resources from it, which allows us to craft more weapons, items, or upgrades for our suit. I didn't really like this addition that much. It felt odd and out of place in a Dead Space game. I don't mind the crafting system, but I'm not sure why the focus was on resource collecting while I'm supposed to be saving the world. We have to complete a simple puzzle to get the tram back into the ship. We encounter our first Hunter, another version of the Ubermorph from the second game or the Hunter from the first game. These enemies regenerate limbs and Again, we have to deal with them by cutting off their appendages and hitting them with stasis so that we can get away. We eventually escape the thing and get the tram working so that we can find the shuttle on the ship. The shuttle isn't in flying condition though, and we need to take it back to the repair bay. First, we have to make a remote relay. We have to find multiple pieces for the relay and craft it using a bench. Unfortunately, the ship is out of fuel, so we have to head to the refueling station. Here, Isaac fuels the ship, but Ellie accidentally started the launch sequence, and we have to get out before we're burned to death. On top of that, we have to get the shuttle bay doors open before the shuttle itself launches. Some gas canisters get caught in the gears for the shuttle door, and we have to use a turret to blow them up while also mowing down waves of necromorphs. The thing explodes and we're spit out of the ship, but the shuttle has made it out and is heading to the repair bay. The shuttle is missing its engine, but luckily we find a new one from wreckage floating out in space. We have to find 3 flight recorders as well from satellites floating in the wreckage of the Terra Nova. This lets us craft a nav module for the shuttle itself. Norton still wants to take the shuttle and leave, but Ellie is convinced that they can stop the markers on the planet below. Isaac makes his way back to the shuttle. He tells Ellie that they have to leave now. We have to pilot the ship through space, shooting mines out of the air while avoiding debris. There's so many moments like this in Dead Space 3, and it really overall feels more like a blockbuster action movie than a horror game. Like I said in my video about Dead Space, one of my only issues with the game was the turret sections, and this game feels like it has so many of its own version of turret sections. The group is forced to crash land on the planet after making contact with too much debris. Isaac wakes up in the wreckage of the ship, separated from the group. We have a new meter to worry about on the planet, our body temperature. I thought this was a neat little mechanic that I actually appreciated and felt more like a survival horror mechanic. Our temperature will drop when walking in the snow, but we can raise it by getting close to the fires burning in the snow. If we let it get to 0, we freeze to death. I thought this mechanic was an interesting addition, but it's swiped away from us pretty soon after this. We get an upgraded suit that's made for the cold weather, and we just don't have to deal with it anymore. Isaac is tossed down the mountain, but can't seem to get in contact with Ellie over comms. We traverse through the cold and eventually find an old comms station, but we still can't reach Ellie. We get inside a building to find Buckle, who is freezing to death. He said the rest of the group got snowsuits, but he couldn't find another. Just then, he succumbs to the cold. We explore the station and get a suit that resists the cold, removing any trace of that cold mechanic for the rest of the game. We find a trail of flares that Ellie and her crew left, and following them leads us to Carver atop a balcony. Before we can rendezvous to him, he gets attacked by necromorphs. Ellie and her crew are alive, but Isaac has to get to them. We encounter the Snow Beast, a new necromorph that will fight multiple times over the course of the game. I really hate this boss. I think it's poorly designed, and I'll tell you why. This is really the only time in the whole game that I felt it necessary to use the new roll feature that Dead Space 3 introduces. The Dead Space series was never one that really needed a roll function, but this boss will rush us, so we have to use it. The boss itself is pretty simple. It has 3 tentacles on its back, which we have to sever to reveal pods that we can then damage. We have to destroy the 3 pods it reveals by severing its tentacles 3 times. It's not a very complex boss overall, but boy, its attacks are insane. This boss really only has one attack, to rush at Isaac and knock him down. You'd think that this would follow some sort of pattern, but it really doesn't. Sometimes the boss will attack once in between you dismembering its tentacles. Sometimes it'll attack you 3 times in a row while you're still down, completely draining your health. It's wildly unpredictable, and I don't think it's to add challenge or complexity to the fight. I think it's purely poor design. On top of that, the tentacles on the left and right of the boss can't be attacked half the time because the creature's front legs are in the way. You can't really get around the boss to attack these side tentacles, and you also can't attack the tentacles after dodging a rush attack because its tentacles are put away when it rushes you. You just have to keep firing and hope the tentacles peek out and you get lucky. I want to be clear here, this boss isn't difficult, it's just frustrating. There's a large difference between the two. You know when a boss is frustrating when you can actively feel that you aren't the reason you're getting hit, but the game itself is the reason. Eventually we defeat it and it runs away. We rendezvous with the team and Ellie hugs Isaac, which clearly Norton isn't happy with. Santos thinks she's found the machine that they're looking for. There's a signal that's coming from the other end of the complex that can help them get to the machine itself. This whole game just feels really odd. There's something I can't quite place, but everything just feels off. It's almost like they don't understand why people were interested in Dead Space in the first place. The game just feels hollow, and we're seeing the same characters, we're seeing the same enemies, we're seeing markers, but it just doesn't feel like Dead Space. Probably because it isn't. This is some weird version of Dead Space that EA thought would sell more copies. It's times like these when I think back to that interview with Glenn Schofield. Listening to him talk about the first game like it was his baby, a masterpiece that he spent his life working towards, his shining moment. And now it's this, some hollow franchise that's being propped up by EA to try and figure out how to make it profitable, which is strange because Dead Space was never profitable in the first place. Outside, Danik and the unitologists arrive and begin to attack Isaac and the group. Isaac eventually finds the signal, which turns out to be a giant frozen necromorph. It emits signals which can be traced back to the machine. We eventually thaw the thing by activating machines around it. Santos finds a blueprint for a probe gun that we need to trace the signals to the machine. We gather the parts for the probe gun and eventually face the snow beast again. It runs away once more when we defeat it. We eventually craft the probe gun and take a cage that transports us inside of the frozen beast. Here we have to follow a signal and shoot probes into different parts of the Nexus. This of course triggers tons of the pack to come and attack us. After fending them off, Ellie says that tons of signals have come through with the probes. Below the planet's surface is where they head to. This must be where the machine is located. Once outside of the Nexus, Norton decides to leave us in the cage and take control of the mission. He heads off to save Ellie. Luckily, we have kinesis and can get out anyways. Isaac is bombarded once exiting the compound. Norton and Carver have been captured by Danik, who reveals that Norton was working with them. The crew overtakes the men before they're killed. Isaac tries to blow Danik up with a grenade, but he gets away. The Nexus is then awake and we have to fight it. We have to shoot various pods to damage it and try to not get eaten, but eventually we do. Inside the Nexus, we have to destroy more pods while avoiding red projectiles volleyed at us. Norton turns on Isaac, blaming him for getting them into this trouble. Norton says he tried to save them and turns his gun on Isaac, but we have the quicker trigger finger. Isaac tries to explain to Ellie what happened, but she's in shock, and the rest of the group are starting to lose hope. Luckily, Santos has found some information about a device called the Codex and something called the Rosetta that's in a nearby lab. We make our way up the mountain, doing tons of rappelling in the process, which Dead Space 3 just loves. I hated a lot of these sequences, especially later in the game. They become pretty challenging, and not because you're trying to overcome the odds that the game throws at you, but because you're trying to interface with the clunky controls. We get a cargo elevator activated, and Santos gets attacked by the snow beast. Carver decides to sacrifice her to save themselves. We have to frustratingly face the snow beast one final time. We destroy it by impaling it with harpoons and rip it in half. Isaac reunites with Ellie and apologizes to her for everything, and they're about to rekindle their relationship before Carver cuts them off. In the lab, they find out that Rosetta is an alien that's been cut into multiple different pieces. Her brain contains information about the markers that they need. We have to travel across the lab, finding different pieces and sending them back to the lab. Once there, we reassemble them. Activating the pieces of Rosetta causes Isaac to have a vision of an alien civilization long ago that discovered a marker. After the ensuing necromorphs took over, a convergence event began. This transferred the organic matter from the planet to create a necromorph moon. The moon is the actual source of the marker symbol. The machine that the aliens built froze the planet and stopped the convergence from happening. Just then, Danik arrives and takes the Codex, which is the key to turning the machine off. The room fills with gas as Isaac leaves and Ellie is trapped inside. Isaac is enraged and he and Carver pursue Danik and his soldiers to try and stop this, but also for Isaac to get his personal revenge on him. We find Danik descending on a large elevator into the planet himself. We have to repel and defeat soldiers shooting at us along the way. Eventually, we have to get inside the planet itself to seek out the alien civilization. We're confronted with multiple panels here that operate using an alien language. We have to use environmental clues to figure out which symbols to input into the machine. Inside, we find the alien machine that's holding off the convergence. We have to make our way through the alien civilization. Here we're introduced to amp pads. These are circles on the ground which we can stand on and will power up our kinesis and stasis abilities. These are paramount in the last couple of chapters of the game because we'll need powerful stasis to keep the hordes of necromorphs at bay. We'll also be able to use jump pads to transport us to different areas of the alien city. To get to the machine, we have to interact with multiple different alien puzzles, most of which are pretty simple, and finally unlock the core itself. Eventually, Danik calls us and tells us that Ellie is still alive, to draw us in. I really don't like this plot point. I'm not sure what the purpose of killing Ellie off was, if she was just going to be revealed to still be alive through a comms call. It's pretty odd, and I feel like they should have just kept her alive and have her get captured by Danik. There's not really a good reason to have the death fake out in there. Isaac already had enough motivation to want to stop the markers in the first place. We eventually get inside the core with the codex in hand. Danik is going to kill Ellie if we don't get him the device. Carver hands the codex over to Danik to save Ellie, and Danik stops the machine. The necromorph moon begins to consume the planet itself. The fate of the entire world is now at stake. Danik is killed by a piece of collapsing rubble. Carver tries to stop the machine himself, but Isaac insists that he go with him. Isaac sends Ellie off with a smooch, giving her the cut-in-half picture of himself. We have to run across pieces of debris and fly through space. Eventually, we face the moon, which is a giant, massive necromorph. We have to use kinesis to shoot markers at its eyes while fending off smaller necromorphs on our platform. We eventually destroy it, and Isaac removes the codex. Carver and Isaac are both whisked away as the moon begins to crash into Tau Volantis. Isaac looks at Ellie's picture as he floats into oblivion. Ellie is mourning Isaac on the shuttle. She can't get any response from him, but she doesn't detect the marker signal. The threat has finally been stopped. She heads back to Earth, leaving Tau Volantis in the past. After the credits, we find out that Isaac is still alive as we briefly hear him call out to Ellie. Before we get to my final thoughts on the game, I'd like to briefly talk about the Dead Space 3 DLC, Awaken. This was another short DLC, this time centering around Isaac and Carver. I haven't talked about this until now, but Dead Space 3 has a co-op function that allows you to play the game with another person. One person plays Isaac and the other person plays Carver. This is the same for the DLC. I briefly played the co-op and it's not too bad. There's really not too much to say about it other than the fact that it's the same game but with another person. There is some extra functionality, like certain weapons that can be crafted to heal each other or attachments that can fill both players' stasis modules. The person playing as Carver will actually see different things at certain points in the game, which brings its own problems for the main story, especially when playing solo. It's alright, and I can see how some people would have fun with this. Even bad games can be good with friends. The story sees Isaac and Carver waking up after the events of Dead Space 3. They're in an underground cave and have learned that the Brethren moons have awakened. These are large necromorph moons, because, yeah, we're just there now, that are heading straight for Earth. Isaac and Carver try to get the Terra Nova working so they can head back to Earth and warn them of the coming threat, maybe even stopping the whole thing. Once they get back to Earth, they realize the moons have already arrived and one of them crashes into the Terra Nova. I'm not sure what the entire point of this DLC was other than to make more money. I'm assuming it was to set up another game in the series because Isaac and Carver were already basically dead at the end of the base game. Why bring them back, introduce a new threat, and then basically kill them again in the DLC? I guess you could make the case that they were supposed to live and Dead Space 4 could have been them fending off the Brethren moons from Earth, but as you know by now, Dead Space 4 never happened. Dead Space overall isn't a great end to the series. It's a game that tried to redirect the entire course of the franchise. It seeked to course correct the series because in EA's mind, they weren't getting enough sales, and chasing trends would get them those sales. They figured if they did what everyone else were doing at the time, that people would follow. In this, they forgot a major aspect of why people wanted to see Dead Space games in the first place, because they were unique. My interest in the first Dead Space game and the series overall was because of its unique take on horror. It was an interesting blend of genres that really hadn't been explored yet. It felt distinct yet familiar. It was a new horizon that I felt had plenty of stories to be told. In the end, EA decided to force the developers to take this interesting and unique idea and conform it to whatever trends were popular at the time. It's interesting because if Dead Space 3 was forced to come out today, it might be a wildly different game because the motivations behind it are dynamic. It's a game that seems out of place. Its story is strange and almost unnecessary. It feels out of place in the series and the gaming scene overall. It feels like one of those generic games that would have come out in the early 2010s. It doesn't feel like it's doing anything special. It also completely misunderstands why people like the series in the first place. EA was trying to widen the audience of the series they had created, but they didn't realize that by trying to widen the audience, they were actually alienating their core fan base. Instead of introducing the game to a wider audience, they narrowed the amount of people that would actually want to play their game. Dead Space 3 still received surprisingly positive reviews. It holds a 78 out of 100 on the Xbox 360 version of the game. Reviewers specifically liked the change to the action genre and felt that the new style was something to be welcomed. Certain publications felt like the story dragged and the grandiose narrative let down the story overall. Dead Space 3 eventually reached number 1 on the sales charts for the UK, but sold 20% less than Dead Space 2. EA considered it another failure, an entry into the list of failures that were the series of Dead Space. We've only covered the mainline entries in the Dead Space series, but there are many other pieces of media that we need to go over, including books, animated movies, comics, and spin-off games. The first spin-off game released in the Dead Space series was Dead Space Ignition. EA wanted to expand the Dead Space universe. They wanted to make the games into a multimedia narrative. The comics and books that we'll be talking about in a bit were also part of this move. It was available as a free download with the pre-order of Dead Space 2. Playing the game would also reward you with items in Dead Space 2, furthering the link between these experiences. It was developed by Visceral Games and Sumo Digital. It was released on October 12, 2010, a few months before Dead Space 2. Dead Space Ignition is pretty short and simple. It's a puzzle game with interspersed comic-style cutscenes. It takes place right before Dead Space 2. We play as Franco DeLille, who's a technician that works on the Sprawl. The only gameplay that's presented in the experience are 3 separate hacking puzzles. The first of these is the Trace Route minigame. This sees us guiding a moving red line towards a goal. We have to fend off pieces of the software that are trying to destroy our virus. We can hit points that will boost our speed or use items that propel us forward, place blockades behind us to stop the enemies or confuse their movements. It's alright, but not very difficult and pretty simple. The second hacking puzzle is called Hardware Crack. We have to use mirrors to guide colored lights to their corresponding goals. This is mostly a pretty simple logic puzzle that requires a bit of thinking. I won't lie, a lot of these had me stumped and took me a bit to get the hang of. There's other things introduced throughout the game, like a third colored light that requires us to combine 2 lasers to create yellow. We can also destroy or remove certain components to get our lasers to their destinations. The last puzzle is called System Override. I'll be honest, I don't think I ever fully comprehended how this minigame worked. Even by the end of the game, it never really made sense to me. You're supposed to send viruses in to attack the system. This mostly works like a tower defense game where you're playing the enemies. You have to break past enemy lines by sending in different units. These antiviruses or protection systems can destroy your components. The only thing stopping us from sending in everything at once is an energy meter on the right that replenishes itself. That being said, we can just brute force this minigame by spamming a few of each type of unit over and over until we win. It's not very hard, and it doesn't really require you to understand how it works to complete it. Overall, the puzzles were fine, but the whole thing left me wondering why I was playing a puzzle game in the Dead Space universe. I guess you could make the case that it makes sense because Isaac would hack things in the main game, but I never played those segments and thought, man, I hope they make this really complicated and develop a standalone game around it. Wouldn't that be cool? It's just kind of unnecessary, and the whole concept feels very shill. It seems like they wanted to squeeze a few extra bucks out of the series. The story itself centers around our main character, Franco DeLille, and his assistant, Sarah Anderson. The two have to repair certain things around the sprawl, and eventually an outbreak occurs. The whole story revolves around them trying to get away from necromorphs and save people in the process. There are certain points in the story where we can choose which path to go down. This will slightly alter what happens in the game, but the ending is still the same. Eventually, Franco arrives at a psychiatric ward and finds a cryo cell that's holding Isaac Clarke. He frees him, and this begins the events of Dead Space 2. As you remember from the beginning of that game, Franco is promptly killed by a necromorph. Overall, this was such a weird release. I don't understand the whole puzzle concept in the context of this series. I understand the rationale, but I don't get why they thought it would be a good idea. I'm also not a huge fan of this art style. It looks very strange, and I don't think it's the best presentation they could have chosen. I don't know why, but for some reason it really reminds me of this old Flash game that I used to play when I was a kid called Sunny. No connection there whatsoever. I just couldn't get that game out of my head when I was playing this. Ignition was received very poorly from critics, most of them saying that it was boring and it felt like filler, which was probably a good call on their part. Dead Space Extraction was the second full spin-off game released in the Dead Space universe. It was co-developed by Visceral Games, who was still known by the name EA Redwood Shores at the time, and Eurocom. It was published by EA and was made originally for the Nintendo Wii. It was eventually ported to the PS3 a couple years after release. The entire game was conceived during the development of the original Dead Space. They wanted to provide more story content to people who played the first game, while also making a title for the Wii. The game itself was a first-person rail shooter. This means that we don't control the movement of the character, just the gun's reticle and shooting. We'll have to interact with puzzles at certain points and can even read text logs along the way. It tries its best to exist in the same world as Dead Space, given the limitations of a system like the Wii. For the most part, I think it pulls it off. It's a decently fun adventure and feels like a more advanced version of something you'd play in the arcade. The game itself is a prequel to Dead Space. It actually takes place right before or around the same time as Downfall. Extraction starts with a crew of miners who are getting the red marker from Aegis 7. You play as Sam Caldwell, who actually begins hallucinating as a side effect of the marker. He begins killing off the rest of his crew and is eventually killed by a squad of soldiers. At this point, we switch to Nathan McNeil, who is investigating the case of what happened on Aegis 7. He meets Gabe Weller, who you might remember from the Dead Space 2 DLC. Of course, things descend into chaos and the necromorphs begin to attack. They discover Lexine, who was previously Sam's girlfriend, but as we know, will become Weller's. The group tried to fly their found shuttle to the Ishimura, but the Ishimura shot them down, causing them to fly into the ship. The group makes their way through the shuttle and eventually encounters Nicole Brennan. Eventually, the crew is looking for a shuttle, a way to get off the ship, but Weller notices Eckhart sending a message to the unitologists. He says they were looking for someone immune to the marker's effects, which may be Lexine. Weller is shot, but Eckhart is killed by a leaper. The group gets in a shuttle and flies off, just as the Kellion transmits that it's entering the ship. Lexine tried to warn them, but they didn't receive the transmission. The final scene shows Lexine being attacked by a necromorph, which was confirmed to be Nathan McNeil post-infection. Dead Space Extraction actually isn't a terrible game. A lot of these spin-off Wii titles had the tendency to be cash grabs, but this one felt pretty interesting. There's also a lot of moments that tie directly into the first game. You can almost find the aftermath of events that happen in Extraction in Dead Space. It's a really interesting concept, and I'm a big fan of how it ties the original story together. One pseudo-spin-off game was released in the Dead Space universe for mobile phones. This was titled, aptly, Dead Space Mobile. It was released the same day as Dead Space 2 and takes place before the beginning of that game. It functions quite a lot like the original games, except on a mobile device. It follows a character named Carrie Norton, who's referred to as Vandal. She inadvertently begins an outbreak on the Titan station and is betrayed by her superior, Tideman, the antagonist of Dead Space 2. I'm not going to go in depth on this game since it's a mobile game and there's really not a lot to discuss here. There are two main books released in the Dead Space universe. The first of these is called Martyr, published by Tor Books in July of 2010. It takes place all the way back on Earth, hundreds of years before the original Dead Space game. It's actually the first piece of media chronologically in the series. The book begins with a child named Chava in a small town. He finds a strange creature and eventually begins hallucinating as people in his town start taking their own lives. The book changes to the perspective of Michael Altman, the figure that the Church of Unitology deifies. He's working in Chicxulub as a geophysicist. They're getting strange readings from the center of a crater, and he's questioned by a man named Charles Hammond. The man begins hallucinating as well and takes his own life when he believes he was being chased. Dredger Corps, a company that specializes in resource mining, investigates the anomaly and finds the black marker. The mission was a failure as all of the people on the retrieval team went insane and killed each other. The video that was released by one of the crew members before their death is covered up, but Altman continues to investigate. He eventually is shown the creature that we saw at the beginning, found by the child, and initiates a full investigation of the crater. Altman eventually recovers the submarine and a piece of the marker with it. A cult starts to develop around the marker, and Altman is disturbed by this. They begin to view him as their prophet because he has seen the thing. Altman eventually blows the whole thing wide open and implicates the military in a huge cover-up. Altman is eventually executed and told before so that a religion will be sprung up in his name to further the marker and ready mankind for evolution. This book was actually surprisingly good for a video game spin-off. It's pretty rare that a book made in a video game universe actually turns out alright, but this wasn't bad. I especially love the idea that Altman never really wanted to be a religious figure, and wasn't involved in the cult. The whole thing that we see in the games is just a media spin on the situation to get the fanatics to do what they want. It's really interesting and a nice way to frame everything. It also solves the prequel problem that the movies have. We know Altman is going to die when reading this story, but the tale still manages to surprise us along the way. The second novel released in the Dead Space universe was called Dead Space Catalyst. It's another prequel book that takes place way before Dead Space. This one wasn't as interesting to me. It takes way too long to get into things, and by the time it gets there, you're not really interested. It's the story of two brothers who live in the slums on a planet called Vindaga, and eventually go separate ways in life. They're both on different sides of the marker situation, and eventually have to deal with the necromorphs and markers. It was pretty slow, kind of boring, and wasn't my favorite. Multiple comics were developed as spin-offs to Dead Space. The first series was just titled Dead Space, and was a prequel to the first game. It was written by Anthony Johnson and featured art by Ben Templesmith. You'll recognize this name if you've seen my Silent Hill full retrospective. He was also the artist for Silent Hill Dying Inside. The art has the same problems that I complained about in Dying Inside. It's rough, the faces look goofy, it's just really hard on the eyes. The comic itself is just alright. It's the classic story we're used to at this point. The tale revolves around the discovery of the red marker and its effect on the people around it. Necromorphs attack, colonists go crazy and begin hallucinating, the whole 9 yards. Like I said before, it's alright, but there's not really a lot here to discuss. It's pretty run-of-the-mill, and I think some of the other comics contextualize the story of Dead Space a little better than this one. The second comic produced for Dead Space was Dead Space Salvage. It's again written by Anthony Johnston, but this time illustrated by Christopher Shy. This is set between Dead Space 1 and 2. The Ishimura has not been found, and a crew called the Magpies are trying to salvage minerals floating in space. They eventually come into contact with the Ishimura and investigate, finding chunks of the marker inside. David Chang is part of the Earth government and is tasked with finding the ship. Most of the crew dies on the ship due to the necromorphs or EarthGov themselves. Eventually, Stefan escapes, being the last one alive. This was actually pretty good. I liked how most of the comic dealt with the fear of hallucinations and paranoia, rather than an overuse of the necromorphs. The art is pretty good for the most part. It's really stylized, and I thought it was interesting to look at. There are some moments where faces are drawn really strange, but it's not that bad. Also, they maybe shouldn't have put blue text on a blue background with no stroke. Just saying. Dead Space Liberation was the final comic that was set in the Dead Space universe. This was written by Ian Edgington and again featured art by Christopher Shy. The book looks similarly good to Dead Space Salvage. Shy has a really interesting style that sort of melds the world together. It doesn't look as good as Salvage, but it's still really unique. The graphic novel was released the same day as Dead Space 3. The story itself is a prequel to Dead Space 3 and centers around John Carver, the character heavily featured in that game. It details an attack on a marker on the planet Uxor and the death of Carver's wife and child. He's captured by Danik and tortured for information on the markers. Carver's family are turned into necromorphs and he's forced to kill them. He tries to take his own life but is stopped by Ellie Langford, who he already met before on Haven Prime. Apparently, Carver's wife was a researcher and Ellie needs her information because she unearthed something big. He gets to Ellie eventually, not for lack of trying by Danik to stop him. The research eventually shows them that the Sovereign colonies found a master signal for the markers. They're eventually attacked by Danik again and fend off him and his crew. They realize they can't translate what information Carver's wife had, so they have to find Isaac Clarke, leading directly into the events of Dead Space 3. This story was alright. I didn't love it as much as Salvage. I felt like it was too much of a promotion for Dead Space 3. I really like Dead Space Salvage because it seemed like a separate thing that was just in the Dead Space universe. This story more feels par for the course of video game tie-in content, which usually leads right up to it and provides motivations for the characters involved. Also, this data that they find is never mentioned in Dead Space 3, so it's kind of retconned anyways. Before we head to the conclusion section, I'd like to quickly wrap up by talking about the entire timeline for the games. I won't go too in-depth on this, but I feel like it's necessary to at least mention overall where certain media is placed in the series, because we talked about a lot of it out of order. Technically, the chronology starts 2 million years ago when the creatures of Tau Volantis found a black marker. The black marker eventually created the Brethren Moon, and the aliens constructed their machine to stop the convergence event. Now, around the 2200s, the events of Dead Space Martyr take place and Michael Altman is killed. Almost 100 years later, the events of Dead Space Catalyst take place, the first time that the red markers were activated. 200 years after that, the events of the Dead Space comics, Extraction, and Dead Space Downfall all take place around the same time, leading into the events of Dead Space. Isaac has his adventure on the Ishimura and crashes a piece of Aegis 7 back into the planet. A few weeks after, we see the destruction of the O'Bannon and the interrogation of its crew in the events of Dead Space Aftermath. Nolan Strauss is transferred to the Sprawl as one of the two people who has been touched by the marker. After this, we see the events of Dead Space Salvage, and the EarthGov recovers the Ishimura. The events of Dead Space Ignition take place around the same time as Dead Space 2 and its DLC. Isaac destroys the Site-12 marker along with the Titan station itself. 3 years later, the events of Dead Space Liberation begin. John Carver teams up with Ellie Langford and her crew to find Isaac Clarke and use him to try and stop the markers altogether. Finally, we end on Dead Space 3, as Isaac and co. head to Tau Volantis and uncover the secrets of the ancient civilization. Clarke and Carver end up back at Earth, only to find that it's being threatened by the Brethren Moons. It's overall nothing too convoluted or crazy, it's just told through so many pieces of media that I figured I'd briefly piece it together here for better understanding. Okay, yeah. So, if you want to just, for the record, say who you are, and then sort of like what your contribution to the Dead Space community is.
Yeah. My name is Gingy. The only really contribution I've made was just the large video I made a couple weeks ago. It was about the just the whole Dead Space series.
I am Boulder Punch. I have done videos on the 3 Dead Space games and the spin-off Dead Space Extraction.
Sure, I'm Mandalore, and I did videos on the first 3 Dead Space games and then Dead Space Extraction.
Okay, so starting back, what was your first experience with Dead Space?
I saw the Twinkle Little Star trailer, and I didn't get to play it until probably a few years after that. It was before Dead Space 2, but I wasn't able to get it at launch.
Man, I don't even remember.
Yeah.
So I was probably 8 or 9 at that time, and there's no way I would have played this game when I was that young. I could barely make it through Halo when I was 8, but I think I must have gotten this on Christmas at some point when I was a kid. I definitely didn't make it far, but I do remember beating all of these games at one point. But I remember having an absolute blast with it when I could actually, power through it.
This is going to sound funny. I was a bit let down by it, and I was put off by it, which is funny because they initially had a demo that came out shortly after Space One came out on. I played it on Xbox 360, and I remember seeing a post about it, I think on GameFAQs, where it's like, oh, try playing with the volume lower, like the music volume lower.
Oh.
That was what really actually put me off. It sounds so weird thinking back on it now, but I just found uh it wasn't like I found it too scary or anything. I mean, the
Mhm.
horror's great in it, but it was more I found the music very overbearing, I guess. Weird first experience. Then once I got past that and uh, played through them, more, it's like I ended up having a very, great experience.
What do you think made Dead Space stand out from other games, other series?
And still to this day, I'm surprised we haven't seen, more games take the approach of, cutting off the limbs. It's just like that combination of just really standing out and getting that feeling right of like, let's end up on a derelict spaceship. How do we get out of this situation?
Yeah, Dead Space is so strange because saying that it separates it from something else is so odd considering it copied Resident Evil 4. But
Yeah.
the I mean, firstly, the HUD itself is just so impressive. I don't think I've ever seen a game pull off a HUD like that game. The sort of atmosphere that the first game especially had. There's just something about going through the Ishimura the first time through that is terrifying. The fact that all the necromorphs are just repurposed versions of the thing it killed, and there's all these different types is gross, but it kind of clues you in, like, what the hell happened here?
I think it's very isolating, that first game especially. It has that kind of feeling of you against everything, and I think it does very well at keeping you feeling kind of claustrophobic, and you have a few options to fight back, which, get better as the game goes on, but it's very good at making you feel like you're kind of figuring things out and actually surviving. It just was you like any space thing like Alien, you just really feel alone out there. It's like just being out in the ocean, like nothing's coming for you there, so you better get out.
What's like one moment that really sticks out to you?
I think one of the big ones for me was the first time you go into like this centrifuge was one where it's so opened up in there compared to a lot of what you've seen before.
Yeah.
And just the first time you go in, like, entering zero gravity in like this big chamber and you frog hop around.
Um, Dead Space 2, there is a good 2-hour section where you go through the entire Church of Unitology.
Yeah.
That's probably one of the best parts in that game. I think if we're being honest, I think the best chapter in Dead Space 2 is when you go back to the Ishimura for a bit.
Mhm.
But from like a story perspective, that whole 2 hours where you're just learning everything about unitology and just uncovering all the bits and pieces is incredible. It's also
Yeah.
extremely ironic because, unless I'm not mistaken, because you start at the very beginning during the tour guide, and then the very final part is you end up at that crypt at the bottom with all the
Mhm.
coffins. Isaac is essentially going through the steps of being a unitologist without
Yeah.
actually being a unitologist.
There was, I guess, this actually plays into both Dead Space One and Dead Space Two, where spoilers for the second Dead Space, where you revisit the USG Shimura.
Mm.
But there's that one room in the first game. It's like a decontamination room, right?
Yeah.
And of course, you're expecting something. It's a very great combat encounter.
Mhm.
Uh, and then I love it when we revisit in the second one. You go through it again, and you're like, oh shit! Like I remember what happened last time. So you're waiting for it. You're waiting for it, and nothing happens. And then you
Mhm.
come back through it again. And of course, shit happens. That was kind of I love that little connection they did between the two games.
What makes Dead Space a series worth covering?
In the pantheon of survival horror titles or action horror, it still kind of stands on its own with just had such a strong vision that you could show. I think I mentioned this in one of my videos. Like you could show anyone who's played Dead Space, like even just a tiny little screenshot or like a tiny portion of the environment. It's like, oh, that's Dead Space.
Because it started as a very derivative kind of idea,
Mhm.
where it's like you go, oh, we're gonna take Resident Evil 4 and put it in space with some System Shock elements. But it was so pioneering in a lot of ways, like having like having the user interface completely like in the world and on screen. Like Dead Space was I think the first mainstream game to really have like elements like that just so in the world and in the setting. It's just such a well realized setting that like they put all this thought into how the world works and how this technology works. And like they did all this baseline kind of foundation for it and then they made it the thing in space.
So for Dead Space particularly, I think it was just the way not only the kind of cosmic threat that is the necromorphs, and then when they get to the Brethren Moon stage in the third game, the first game kind of sets this tone. You have the active plot, which is getting out of the Ishimura, and then it's like, oh, there is way more than just that at this point. And then Dead Space 2 expands on it, and Dead Space 3 kind of does its thing with it. But I think the way they ended the game was actually great. Learning about just incomprehensible beings that you can't even begin to imagine is just a really cool story beat that I love looking into.
If you had control over the series, what would you have done differently? Or would you have left it the same?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that they needed to drop was that dumbass love story between Ellie, Norton, and Isaac. I was so sick of it. I absolutely despised it because it took over so many narrative moments when they were like trying to find the mountain or getting inside the place, and Norton's like, "Oh, I'm gonna go trap Isaac, or I'm gonna go work with Danik." Like that, that just doesn't make sense. Everything else was kind of okay. I think once you assemble Rosetta and you get like the real story of Tau Volantis, from then on, it's great. I like the concept of asymmetrical co-op. I think having a player do one thing while the other player is doing something and seeing totally different things happen is really cool. I can't believe they gambled that entire gimmick. Like they gambled Carver's entire character on a gimmick.
Yeah. Well, one thing I talked about, and I'm sure you've probably noticed this too, like there's kind of these two distinct sections, right? There's like the first section where it's the ship graveyard, right? And it's like, oh, this looks kind of intriguing, like how we could kind of go around and do some optional missions and come back to it later. And then of
Mhm.
course you go down planet side, and it's like, oh, cool, maybe this is going to be more like the thing or whatnot, or dealing with a lot of outside time and balancing that, making sure like you don't freeze your ass off
Mhm.
or die as a result. I would have chosen one or the other.
That's man, that's such a big question. I think a lot of elements for 3, as it is, are on a very rough level completely fine,
Mhm.
but it's just how they executed stuff. I will go on record to say that I hope the remake keeps the love triangle, but just does it differently. And what if like he's just better than Isaac?
Mhm.
Like that's some more kind of real life horror or fears people might have about
Yeah.
what if someone I like just meets someone better than me? And
Yeah.
like Isaac can still kill him if it's on accident or on purpose, but like having him be like a good person who fucking dies from it and now she's just with Isaac. It's like there's a little more to it there compared to having him just be this sort of irredeemable piece of shit who just dies and Ellie's like, "Oh, he's dead, but now I'm back with you who I really wanted." So,
Looking ahead, you know, what are your hopes for the future, the remake? Do you have like an ideal scenario for Dead Space moving forward?
I don't know. I mean, I'm still I'm kind of in disbelief that a remake is happening still. But it does look like Motive is they're really trying to make it like a worthy remake. From
Yeah.
what little I've seen so far, like them opening up the areas and adding more options for backtracking and just like it's clearly not just a cash grab where they're doing it one to one with like a graphical update and just kind of getting it out. Best case scenario is that the remake expands on the strengths of the original game and they do the same thing with 2
Mhm.
and then they could work on on making 3 different. So yeah, I guess my hope is that they sort of play to the strengths of what made those games great for a new audience, and maybe they could kind of retool 3 to be more in line with the original ideas before it got meddled with to hell and back.
Um, well, in the first place, it's like they never should have shut down Visceral Games, and you know, they wanted to take a break from the series for a bit. It's like, okay, whatever. Um, I do hope we kind of get a more definitive conclusion to the series, which, especially with Dead Space 3, especially with the DLC ending, is building up to something. And obviously, there were some plans they had for Dead Space 4, which I don't know if it would have wrapped up the series. But I've become more at this point of, just leave the series where it is. Like,
I think because Dead Space 1 is in a nice spot where like it's been like 14 years, probably needs a remake, but the first game looks pretty damn good. The remake itself looks great. It is absolutely justified. This game will never have like a The Last of Us kind of argument. Like no one's arguing whether or not you should buy it because of the graphical upgrade. But this is so strange to me because this is like the one game I have ever like thought about buying that I'm actually like morally conflicted about. I've never had this before because EA pushed Visceral, at least to my knowledge, pushed them to make a bit more action in Dead Space 2, and then the game didn't exactly sell well. They pushed them to make more action for Dead Space 3, and we all know how that turned out. And so they shut down a game that they kind of killed, and then shut down a studio, but just because they have the rights, they're now going to remake this thing. That would be like literally the only reason I would not buy the game is just because like that's so petty. But I know that there's genuine people, newer people as well, that are working on this title.
I feel like I have to talk about Callisto Protocol a little bit. I feel like it's intertwined in this video. So what having those thoughts on the remake, what do you feel about the Callisto Protocol?
I mean, if I had to choose one, I would choose Callisto Protocol. I mean, I'd rather choose a new game than a remake because, I mean, you can always, the original game's been out already. You can just load that up whenever.
Callisto Protocol, you got a new studio. That's helmed by a team that a lot of people spent the time on Dead Space. Even though it's obviously heavily influenced by a spiritual successor, it's a new IP, and that's always something I'm always such a big proponent of. And that's why, like I said, with Flitterhead, like the guy who did the original Silent Hill, I'm really looking forward to seeing what comes of that because it's a new property from someone who has this kind of experience. I have higher expectations for Callisto Protocol.
So it's kind of hard because the gamer answer is you say that EA is evil and that you hope that Callisto Protocol wipes the floor with it. But it's also like Motive's also in a very shitty situation because it's not their fault what happened with Visceral and all that. It was a job assigned to them that they seem to be doing a very, very good job on from what they've shown. I guess I don't have much of a stake in who wins, and I hope that Callisto Protocol does wonderfully. It's like if I wanted one project to win and the other has to be shut down, I'd want Callisto Protocol to take that because at least it's like they're doing something new, whatever it is, compared to giving a remaster or remake of something we've had before. And it's like, and if Dead Space fizzles out the remake, then we still have the old games. Callisto Protocol, who knows what they'll do with that. It'd just be neat to see something different.
Dead Space was the definition of starting out strong. Its first game was probably one of the scariest experiences I've had in a long time. It's a horror masterpiece. Some horror games turn out scary. Sure, when you're playing them, you're terrified. But horror masterpieces don't turn out scary. They're made scary. Dead Space feels like it was purposefully crafted to terrify you. No piece feels out of place. There were no accidents here. Everything was designed to terrify you, and it works incredibly well. Dead Space 2 was great in its own right. It was a fantastic action game. Sure, it did kind of feel like it didn't know where it wanted to go, like a child choosing a parent in court. But if that's the case, then Dead Space 3 was the abusive father of the series. And oh boy, did he get custody. Dead Space 3 was a rough transition. It was a shock to the system, a realization that this series would never be the same again, if it even continued. But that feels like it was ages ago. Dead Space 3 came out in 2013, almost a decade gone. But of course, that wouldn't be the last that we would hear of Dead Space. In 2021, word of a Dead Space remake came about. A complete ground-up retelling of the story from the first game. It would again be published by EA, but this time developed by Motive Studio. These people previously worked on Star Wars Squadrons and Star Wars Battlefront 2. You're probably wondering, where's Visceral Games at in all this? Well, that's the funny thing. EA just kind of let them off their chains after Dead Space 3, and they've been making innovative, creative new IPs ever since. That's not true. The true story is that multiple projects were started and canceled involving Visceral Games before EA officially shut them down in 2017. Most people felt like their closure was a sign that EA was trying to fully cull their roster of single-player games. Of course, they denied this, but it was hard to feel like that wasn't the case at the time. So clearly Visceral isn't working on the remake, but Motive is, and they seem okay. Now, a lot of information has been revealed about the Dead Space remake already. It kind of feels like most of the recent news cycles have just been flooded with news, articles, and little announcements about changes or upgrades to the game. And it looks alright. Of course, I don't really think Dead Space needs to be remade. I still think that the game works today, and having played it just recently as 2022, it doesn't feel dated at all. With that being said, the original games are very widely available to a large amount of audiences, especially with Game Pass and the backwards compatibility feature of the Series S and X. Because of that, I can't be too mad that a remake is getting made because the original is still there. There are some changes that are pretty exciting, like the ship being connected and there being less backtracking overall. There are some things though that I don't really love, like the new suit design or Isaac speaking, but those are really just my opinions. Now, with all that being said, I feel like it would be disingenuous to make a video about Dead Space in November 2022 and not talk about the elephant in the room, the Callisto Protocol. If you haven't heard about this game yet, it is a sci-fi atmospheric horror game set in space, directed by none other than Glenn Schofield himself. The Callisto Protocol seems inextricably linked to the tale of Dead Space at this point. The game seems to look and feel a lot like Dead Space, and it seems like Glenn Schofield is returning to the horror genre to once again try and revolutionize. With both of these games coming out within a month or so of each other, it kind of feels like there's a tension in the air. It's just such a strange situation, with a remake of a game releasing and a new IP that's a spiritual successor to the original game with the original series creator behind it, both releasing within a month. If I'm being honest though, I think I'm more excited to see what Glenn Schofield has in store than a remake of Dead Space. Am I gonna play both of them? Sure, but if I had to bet on one, I'd put my money on Callisto. This is sort of the happy ending to the tale though, because even though Dead Space turned out to be something Schofield probably didn't want, he gets to kind of come back in a roundabout way and try to have it his way again. In the end, we'll just have to see how both of these games turn out. But it doesn't really matter, because we'll always feel the effects that Dead Space had on the horror genre and gaming overall, and that will never change. Bye, Dad.